The purple striped toga that marked Roman emperors carried with it a curse that few modern people truly comprehend. Unlike the hereditary monarchies that would dominate medieval Europe, the Roman imperial system operated more like a deadly game of musical chairs, where the music could stop at any moment, and those left standing faced execution, exile, or worse. The path to the imperial throne was paved not with ceremony and coronation, but with blood, betrayal, and the constant threat of violent death. When Augustus established the Principate in 27 BCE, he created what appeared to be a stable system of governance. Yet beneath this veneer of constitutional monarchy lay a fundamental flaw that would plague the empire for centuries. There was no clear, legally binding mechanism for imperial succession. The emperor was simultaneously a military commander, religious leader, and political figurehead, but unlike a king, he could not simply pass his authority to his eldest son through divine right. Instead, each transition of power became a potential crisis that could tear the empire apart. The brutal mathematics of imperial succession reveal the true horror of wearing the purple. From Augustus through Constantine, approximately 75% of Roman emperors died violent deaths. This wasn't merely bad luck or the hazards of ancient life. It was the inevitable result of a system that created emperors through violence and maintained them through fear. When Septimius Severus advised his sons to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, he wasn't offering cynical political advice, but revealing the stark reality of imperial survival. Civil wars became the empire's primary method of determining succession, transforming what should have been orderly transitions into bloodbaths that consumed entire legions. The Year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE demonstrated how quickly imperial authority could collapse when competing claimants emerged. Galba, who had overthrown Nero, lasted barely 7 months before Otho's supporters hacked him to pieces in the Roman Forum. Otho himself survived only 3 months before Vitellius's Rhine legions crushed his forces at Bedriacum. Vitellius managed 8 months before Vespasian's Eastern armies stormed Rome and executed him in the streets. These weren't isolated incidents, but recurring patterns that defined imperial politics. The empire's vast size meant that ambitious generals commanding distant legions could always challenge the central authority, especially when news of an emperor's death or weakness took weeks to travel across the provinces. A governor in Britain or Syria could declare himself emperor and march on Rome before the capital even learned of his rebellion. This geographical reality meant that every emperor faced potential threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The Praetorian Guard, supposedly the emperor's personal bodyguards, evolved into the empire's most dangerous political force. These elite soldiers, stationed in Rome itself, possessed both the means and opportunity to make or break emperors at will. Their barracks on the outskirts of the city became a shadow palace where the real decisions about imperial succession were often made. The Praetorians understood their unique position perfectly. They were close enough to strike at any moment, yet essential enough that no emperor could simply disband them without risking immediate revolt. The Guard's transformation from protectors to kingmakers reached its most grotesque expression during the Year of the Six Emperors in 193 CE. After assassinating Commodus on New Year's Eve 192 CE, the Praetorians allowed the elderly Senator Pertinax to assume power. Pertinax, however, made the fatal mistake of attempting to restore discipline and reduce the Guard's privileges. Within 3 months, the Praetorians had murdered him in his own palace, stabbing him repeatedly as he tried to reason with his attackers. What followed was unprecedented in Roman history. The Praetorians literally auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder. They announced that whoever offered the largest donative to each guardsman would become emperor. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, outbid his rival Sulpicianus by promising 25,000 sestertii per soldier, roughly equivalent to 5 years' salary for an ordinary legionnaire. The transaction was conducted like a slave auction, with the Praetorians calling out bids and encouraging higher offers. Julianus paid the money and was proclaimed emperor, but his reign lasted only 66 days before Septimius Severus arrived with his Pannonian legions and had him executed. This auction revealed the complete breakdown of imperial legitimacy. The empire's highest office had been reduced to a commodity sold to the highest bidder by the very men sworn to protect it. The incident sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world, demonstrating that imperial authority rested not on law, tradition, or divine sanction, but purely on the ability to pay armed men enough money to keep them loyal. The emperor's position required an impossible balancing act between three primary constituencies: the Senate, the military, and the urban plebs of Rome. Each group possessed the power to destroy an emperor, yet their interests were fundamentally incompatible. The Senate, composed of wealthy aristocrats, wanted reduced military spending, lower taxes, and respect for traditional republican institutions. The legions demanded regular pay increases, bonuses, and profitable campaigns that would provide plunder and land grants. The Roman mob required free grain distributions, spectacular games, and public works projects that provided employment. Satisfying any one group inevitably meant alienating the others. An emperor who increased military pay had to raise taxes, infuriating the Senate. One who reduced spending on games and grain doles faced riots in the streets of Rome. An emperor who respected senatorial privileges appeared weak to the soldiers, who expected their commander to dominate civilian authority. This three-way tension created a political environment where every decision carried potentially fatal consequences. Marcus Aurelius exemplified these impossible contradictions. Revered by later generations as a philosopher-emperor, he spent most of his reign fighting wars along the Danube frontier while struggling to maintain imperial finances. His Stoic principles conflicted with the brutal realities of imperial politics, yet he had no choice but to order executions, wage aggressive wars, and make compromises that violated his personal ethics. Even this most admired of emperors faced military revolts, including a serious rebellion by Avidius Cassius in 175 CE that nearly split the empire. The psychological burden of imperial power was perhaps the cruelest aspect of wearing the purple. Every emperor lived with the knowledge that most of his predecessors had died violent deaths, often at the hands of their closest associates. Paranoia became a survival mechanism rather than a character flaw. Domitian installed mirrors in the palace corridors so he could see around corners and detect potential assassins. Caracalla traveled with a permanent bodyguard of Germanic warriors who owed loyalty only to him, not to Rome. Diocletian eventually abdicated rather than face the inevitable violent end that awaited most emperors. The constant threat of assassination poisoned every relationship and decision. An emperor could never be certain whether his advisors were loyal or plotting his overthrow. Military commanders who proved too successful became potential rivals who might need elimination. Even family members posed threats. Caracalla murdered his brother Geta in their mother's arms, and Constantine executed his own son Crispus on suspicion of treason. Sleep itself became dangerous for emperors. Caligula reportedly suffered from severe insomnia, possibly exacerbated by the knowledge that most imperial assassinations occurred at night, or in private moments when the emperor's guard was relaxed. The palace, which should have been the safest place in the empire, became a maze of potential death traps where every servant, guard, or visitor might be a killer. The empire's sheer size compounded these psychological pressures. An emperor in Rome could never be certain what was happening in distant provinces. Revolts could simmer for months before news reached the capital. Ambitious governors had time to build support, suborn legions, and prepare invasions before the emperor even learned of their treachery. This uncertainty meant that every dispatch from the provinces carried potential doom, every delayed messenger might signal rebellion, and every military victory by a distant commander could presage civil war. The financial pressures of maintaining imperial power added another layer of stress. The emperor was expected to personally fund games, public works, and military bonuses from his private resources. The imperial treasury and the emperor's personal wealth were theoretically separate, but in practice, emperors regularly used their own money to cover state expenses. This created a vicious cycle where emperors had to confiscate property from wealthy citizens to maintain their position, which in turn created more enemies and increased the likelihood of assassination plots. The emperor's breakfast table presented a daily reminder that death could arrive with the morning meal. Tasters sampled every dish before it reached imperial lips, yet even this precaution offered limited protection. Claudius had employed food tasters for years before his wife Agrippina allegedly poisoned him using a method that bypassed this safeguard entirely. She coated a feather with toxin and used it to induce vomiting after he had eaten a meal of mushrooms, allowing the poison to be introduced directly into his throat during the purging process. The emperor's most intimate moments, eating, sleeping, bathing, became elaborate security operations where trust was a luxury no ruler could afford. The imperial court operated as a carefully orchestrated theater of suspicion where every gesture carried potential meaning and every conversation might be reported to hostile ears. Caracalla's relationship with his younger brother Geta exemplified how imperial paranoia could corrupt even the most fundamental human bonds. The two brothers, joint heirs to Septimius Severus, had been raised together in the same palace, educated by the same tutors, and groomed for shared power. Yet the moment their father died in 211 CE, their relationship transformed into a deadly rivalry that would define the next phase of imperial history. The brothers initially attempted to rule jointly, dividing the empire between them and establishing separate courts within the same palace complex. This arrangement created an atmosphere of unprecedented tension within the imperial household. Servants found themselves caught between competing loyalties, never certain which brother would ultimately emerge victorious. Palace guards were split between factions, with some protecting Caracalla's quarters while others secured Geta's wing. Even their mother, Julia Domna, became a focal point of suspicion as both sons wondered whether she favored one over the other. The psychological pressure of this arrangement proved unbearable for both brothers. They could not eat together without wondering if the other had poisoned the food. They could not attend public ceremonies without calculating whether their sibling might use the occasion for an assassination attempt. Sleep became nearly impossible as each brother stationed guards outside the other's chambers, creating a surveillance network within their own home. The palace staff reported that both emperors began suffering from severe insomnia and digestive problems, physical manifestations of the constant stress under which they lived. Caracalla ultimately resolved this intolerable situation through direct action. In December 211 CE, he arranged a meeting with Geta in their mother's private apartments, supposedly to negotiate a permanent division of the empire. Julia Domna had requested this meeting, hoping to reconcile her sons and end the destructive rivalry that was paralyzing the government. She positioned herself between the two brothers as they entered her chamber, believing her presence would prevent violence. The meeting lasted only minutes. Caracalla had concealed a group of Praetorian centurions in an adjacent room, and at his signal, they burst through the doorway with drawn swords. Geta immediately understood his fate and threw himself into his mother's arms, begging for protection. Julia Domna attempted to shield her younger son with her own body, but the centurions struck repeatedly with their gladii, stabbing both mother and son as they clung to each other. Geta died in his mother's embrace, his blood soaking her robes as she screamed for mercy that never came. The assassination's aftermath revealed the systematic nature of imperial paranoia. Caracalla did not simply eliminate his brother, he ordered the execution of every person who might potentially oppose his sole rule. An estimated 20,000 people died in the purges that followed Geta's murder, including senators, equestrians, soldiers, and even slaves who had served in Geta's household. The emperor's logic was brutally simple. Anyone who had shown loyalty to Geta might harbor resentment against his killer, and resentment could eventually transform into rebellion. This massacre extended to the most trivial connections. Caracalla ordered the death of actors who had performed in plays that Geta enjoyed, athletes who had competed in games that his brother sponsored, and merchants who had supplied goods to his household. The emperor's paranoia had evolved beyond rational calculation into a systematic attempt to erase his brother's existence from history. Geta's name was chiseled from inscriptions throughout the empire, his portraits were destroyed, and speaking his name became a capital offense. Yet even this comprehensive elimination of potential threats failed to provide Caracalla with the security he craved. The emperor understood that his actions had created new enemies among the families and friends of those he had killed. Every execution generated multiple new threats as relatives sought revenge for their murdered kin. The emperor found himself trapped in an escalating cycle of violence, where each attempt to increase his security actually multiplied the number of people who wanted him dead. The network of informants that surrounded every emperor represented both a necessity and a curse that poisoned all human relationships within the imperial court. These spies, known as speculators or curiosi, operated throughout the palace, the city of Rome, and the distant provinces, creating a surveillance apparatus that would have impressed later totalitarian regimes. No conversation was private, no letter was secure, and no relationship was beyond suspicion when the emperor's agents might be listening from hidden alcoves or reading correspondence before it reached its intended recipient. The recruitment of these informants followed predictable patterns that revealed the moral corruption inherent in the imperial system. Slaves made ideal spies because their legal status prevented them from refusing orders, and their intimate access to elite households provided valuable intelligence. Freedmen often served as informants to demonstrate loyalty to their former masters or to gain advancement in the imperial bureaucracy. Even senators and equestrians could be compromised through debt, blackmail, or promises of preferment, creating a web of surveillance that extended throughout Roman society. The information gathered by these networks often proved unreliable, yet emperors had no choice but to act on reports that might be fabricated, exaggerated, or deliberately misleading. A slave seeking to eliminate a rival might report imaginary conversations about treason. A debtor could invent conspiracies to deflect attention from his own financial crimes. Ambitious courtiers regularly denounced their competitors to remove obstacles to their own advancement. The emperor received a constant stream of accusations, denunciations, and warnings, but determining which reports represented genuine threats required investigative resources that rarely existed. The case of Sejanus under Tiberius demonstrated how this surveillance system could be manipulated by the very people it was designed to monitor. Sejanus, as Praetorian prefect, controlled much of the intelligence network that reported to the emperor. He systematically fed Tiberius false information about supposed conspiracies among senators and imperial family members, convincing the emperor to order executions that eliminated Sejanus's own rivals. For years, Tiberius believed he was protecting himself from genuine threats when he was actually serving as an unwitting tool in his subordinates' rise to power. The psychological impact of living under constant surveillance proved devastating for emperors who could never escape the knowledge that their every word and action was being observed and reported. Private conversations became impossible when servants, guards, and even family members might be recording details for later transmission to hostile parties. The emperor's personal relationships withered under this scrutiny, as friends and advisors learned to speak in careful euphemisms and avoid any statement that might be construed as treasonous. Domitian's reign illustrated the extreme paranoia that could result from this surveillance culture. The emperor installed polished marble panels throughout his palace corridors that functioned as mirrors, allowing him to observe anyone approaching from behind. He conducted important meetings while walking in open gardens where concealed listeners could not hide, and he frequently changed the location of his sleeping quarters to prevent assassins from predicting his movements. These precautions consumed enormous amounts of time and energy that should have been devoted to governing the empire. The emperor's isolation was further intensified by the security protocols that governed his daily routine. Every person who entered the imperial presence had to be searched for weapons, a process that included not only obvious items like daggers and swords, but also seemingly innocent objects that might be used for assassination. Styluses for writing could be sharpened into stabbing instruments. Belt buckles could be fashioned into makeshift weapons. Even hairpins and jewelry required inspection, since they might conceal poison or sharp edges. These searches extended beyond physical objects to include examinations of the individuals themselves. Visitors to the emperor underwent questioning about their backgrounds, their recent activities, and their reasons for seeking an audience. Palace guards maintained detailed records of everyone who entered the imperial quarters, creating a bureaucracy of suspicion that tracked the movements of thousands of people throughout the Roman world. This documentation provided valuable intelligence, but also created a paper trail that could be used against the emperor if it fell into hostile hands. The process of making life and death decisions about suspected conspirators placed an enormous psychological burden on emperors who understood that their judgments were often based on incomplete or unreliable information. The Roman legal system provided some protections for citizens accused of ordinary crimes, but charges of treason against the emperor fell into a special category where normal procedural safeguards were frequently suspended. The emperor served as both accuser and judge in these cases, creating a conflict of interest that virtually guaranteed biased outcomes. Torture played a central role in extracting confessions from suspected conspirators, but the information obtained through these methods was notoriously unreliable. Victims under torture would say anything to stop their suffering, often implicating innocent people or fabricating elaborate conspiracies that existed only in their tortured imaginations. Yet emperors felt compelled to use these techniques because the alternative, allowing potential assassins to remain free, seemed even more dangerous than acting on false confessions. The torture chambers beneath the imperial palaces became theaters of horror, where suspected traitors endured systematic brutality designed to break their resistance and extract information. The standard methods included the rack, which stretched victims until their joints separated, the strapado, which dislocated shoulders by suspending prisoners from their bound wrists, and various forms of burning, crushing, and mutilation that left survivors permanently disabled even if they were eventually released. Marcus Aurelius, despite his philosophical commitment to Stoic virtue, found himself ordering these tortures when faced with the rebellion of Avidius Cassius in 175 CE. The emperor needed to determine the scope of the conspiracy and identify other potential rebels before they could coordinate their efforts. The interrogations revealed a network of supporters throughout the eastern provinces, but they also implicated numerous innocent individuals who had been denounced by tortured prisoners seeking to end their suffering. Marcus Aurelius was forced to choose between executing potentially innocent people or risking that genuine conspirators might escape detection. The emperor's decisions in these cases carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Every execution created grieving families who might seek revenge, while every acquittal suggested weakness that could encourage future conspiracies. The emperor walked a tightrope where mercy might be interpreted as vulnerability and harshness could generate new enemies. There was no safe choice, only different forms of danger that required constant calculation and recalculation as circumstances changed. The physical isolation imposed by security measures transformed the imperial palace from a symbol of power into a luxurious prison that separated emperors from normal human contact. The elaborate protocols that governed access to the emperor meant that he rarely encountered anyone who was not either a potential threat or a carefully vetted subordinate. Spontaneous conversations became impossible when every interaction had to be planned, monitored, and recorded by the security apparatus. This isolation was particularly evident in the emperor's relationship with the broader population of Rome. While earlier emperors like Augustus had maintained some connection with ordinary citizens through public appearances and informal encounters, later rulers found themselves increasingly cut off from the people they governed. The crowds that gathered to see the emperor were carefully controlled, with known troublemakers removed and potential assassins identified before the emperor appeared in public. The emperor's family life suffered particularly severe damage from these security requirements. Wives and children lived under the same surveillance as the emperor himself, with their movements monitored and their relationships scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Imperial children grew up knowing that their tutors, playmates, and servants were all potential informants who might report their words and actions to hostile parties. Marriage became a political calculation rather than a personal choice, as emperors needed spouses who could be trusted with state secrets and who would not become focal points for opposition conspiracies. Caracalla's own death in 217 CE demonstrated the ultimate futility of even the most elaborate security measures. Despite his extensive precautions and his systematic elimination of potential threats, the emperor was killed by his own bodyguard during a military campaign in Mesopotamia. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who organized the assassination, had been one of Caracalla's most trusted subordinates, a man who had access to the emperor's private quarters and detailed knowledge of his security arrangements. The assassination occurred during a brief moment when Caracalla had dismissed his Germanic bodyguards to relieve himself privately during a march. A single soldier, Martialis, approached the emperor as if to deliver a message and then stabbed him with a concealed dagger. The killing required only seconds, but it had been planned for months by men who understood exactly how to exploit the brief vulnerabilities in even the most comprehensive security system. The assassination of Caracalla revealed a fundamental truth about imperial power that no amount of paranoia could overcome. The empire itself had grown too vast and complex for any single human being to effectively govern. While emperors obsessed over potential assassins lurking in palace corridors, the real threat to their survival lay in the crushing administrative burden that consumed their waking hours and drove many to physical and mental collapse. The purple toga that marked imperial authority came with responsibilities that would challenge even modern governments equipped with instantaneous communication and sophisticated bureaucratic systems. The Roman Empire at its height encompassed approximately 5 million square kilometers of territory stretching from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the first cataract of the Nile in southern Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. This vast expanse included 3 continents, hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, and populations speaking dozens of different languages. Managing this territorial colossus required constant communication between the imperial center in Rome and provincial governors scattered across thousands of miles of often hostile terrain. The empire's communication system relied entirely on human messengers traveling on foot, horseback, or by ship across routes that were frequently disrupted by weather, warfare, or banditry. A message sent from Rome to the governor of Britain required approximately 40 days to reach its destination under ideal conditions, but winter storms, Germanic raids across the Rhine, or Gallic uprisings could extend this journey to 3 months or more. The return trip with the governor's response meant that a simple exchange of correspondence between the emperor and his representatives in distant provinces could consume half a year. This communication lag created administrative nightmares that multiplied exponentially across the empire's numerous provinces. An emperor issuing instructions about tax collection in Egypt might receive reports about the previous year's harvest, while his orders were still traveling toward Alexandria. Military commanders requesting reinforcements for campaigns against Germanic tribes might find their battles concluded before the emperor even learned they had begun. Provincial governors faced with local emergencies had no choice but to act independently, knowing that imperial approval or disapproval would arrive months after their decisions had already shaped events. The Emperor Trajan discovered these communication limitations during his Dacian campaigns when reports from the Rhine frontier arrived describing Germanic incursions that had occurred 6 weeks earlier. By the time Trajan could dispatch orders to the affected legions, the raiders had already withdrawn across the river with their plunder, leaving Roman settlements burned and their populations enslaved or scattered. The emperor found himself constantly reacting to events that had concluded before he learned of them, a reactive approach that undermined the strategic planning essential for effective governance. Weather patterns added another layer of unpredictability to imperial communications. Mediterranean shipping, which carried the bulk of official correspondence between Rome and the eastern provinces, ceased entirely during the winter months when storms made sea travel suicidal. From November through March, the emperor received virtually no information from governors in Syria, Egypt, or Asia Minor, creating a communications blackout that lasted nearly half the year. During these months, provincial administrators operated with complete autonomy, making decisions that could commit the empire to expensive military campaigns or diplomatic agreements without any input from the central government. The Alpine passes that connected Rome with the northern provinces became impassable during heavy snowfalls, cutting communication with the Rhine and Danube frontiers precisely when Germanic and Dacian tribes were most likely to launch winter raids against Roman settlements. Emperors learned about barbarian invasions only when spring thaws reopened the mountain roads, often discovering that entire provinces had been devastated while they remained ignorant in their Roman palaces. The empire's food supply presented an even more immediate and potentially catastrophic administrative challenge that demanded the emperor's constant attention. Rome's population had swollen to over 1 million inhabitants by the 2nd century CE, making it the largest city in the ancient world and creating logistical demands that strained the empire's resources to their breaking point. This massive urban population produced virtually no food of its own, depending entirely on grain shipments from distant provinces to prevent starvation and social collapse. Egypt served as Rome's primary granary, providing approximately 20 million modi of wheat annually through a complex system of Nile River transport, Mediterranean shipping, and overland distribution that required precise coordination across thousands of miles. The emperor personally supervised this grain supply through the Praefectus Annani, an official responsible for ensuring that sufficient wheat reached Roman warehouses to feed the urban population throughout the year. Failure in this system meant not merely inconvenience but potential revolution, as hungry mobs had historically overthrown governments that could not provide basic sustenance. The Egyptian grain harvest depended entirely on the annual Nile flood, a natural phenomenon that varied dramatically from year to year and could not be predicted or controlled by Roman administrators. Insufficient flooding left fields parched and crops withered, while excessive flooding destroyed storage facilities and transportation infrastructure. The emperor received reports about flood levels months after the agricultural damage had already occurred, leaving him unable to arrange alternative food sources until the following year's planting season. North African provinces provided supplementary grain supplies, but these regions faced their own agricultural challenges, including locust swarms, drought, and tribal raids that could devastate entire harvests without warning. The Emperor Commodus faced a severe food crisis in 189 CE when simultaneous crop failures in Egypt and Tunisia combined with pirate attacks on grain ships to create shortages that triggered riots throughout Rome. The urban population blamed the emperor personally for their hunger, and only massive emergency purchases of grain from Gaul and Spain at inflated prices prevented complete social breakdown. The transportation of grain from provincial sources to Roman consumers required a maritime logistics network that employed hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors, and countless dock workers, warehouse managers, and distribution officials. This system operated under constant threat from storms, pirates, and mechanical failures that could sink entire fleets carrying months' worth of food supplies. The emperor maintained detailed records of ship departures and arrivals, calculating precisely how much grain was in transit at any given moment, and how long existing stockpiles would last if new shipments were delayed. Pirates operating from bases in Cilicia, Crete, and the Balearic Islands posed a persistent threat to grain convoys that required constant military attention and enormous expenditures on naval patrols. These maritime raiders understood the strategic importance of Rome's food supply and deliberately targeted grain ships to maximize the political impact of their attacks. A successful pirate raid that captured or sank a large grain convoy could trigger food shortages that undermined the emperor's authority more effectively than any military defeat. The emperor's financial responsibilities created another layer of administrative burden that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy, while generating constant political pressure from competing interest groups. The imperial budget had to fund not only the basic operations of government, but also the massive public works projects, military campaigns, and entertainment spectacles that Roman citizens expected from their rulers. Balancing these expenditures against available revenues required detailed knowledge of economic conditions throughout the empire and careful calculation of the political consequences of every financial decision. Military expenses dominated the imperial budget, consuming approximately 75% of total revenues during peacetime and even larger percentages during active campaigns. The empire maintained roughly 300,000 professional soldiers distributed among 30 legions and numerous auxiliary units, each requiring regular pay, equipment, supplies, and retirement benefits. These costs were fixed and non-negotiable since unpaid soldiers invariably mutinied and often proclaimed rival emperors who promised better compensation. The emperor personally reviewed military payrolls and approved major expenditures for weapons, fortifications, and campaign supplies. This oversight required detailed understanding of conditions along thousands of miles of frontier, where local commanders constantly requested additional funds for everything from new siege engines to winter clothing for troops stationed in harsh climates. The emperor had to distinguish between legitimate military needs and inflated requests from corrupt officers seeking to embezzle imperial funds. Public works projects represented another major drain on imperial finances that the emperor could not ignore without facing political consequences. Roman citizens expected their rulers to provide magnificent buildings, roads, aqueducts, and entertainment facilities that demonstrated the empire's power and prosperity. The Colosseum alone cost an estimated 100 million sestertii to construct, equivalent to the annual pay of approximately 25,000 legionnaires. The Emperor Trajan's Forum required even larger expenditures, consuming revenues that could have funded entire military campaigns. These construction projects created employment for thousands of workers while providing visible symbols of imperial generosity, but they also generated enormous cost overruns and delays that frustrated emperors trying to manage limited budgets. The Emperor Hadrian spent years personally inspecting construction sites throughout the empire, calculating costs and reviewing architectural plans while simultaneously handling military reports, legal appeals, and diplomatic correspondence. The imperial bureaucracy itself consumed substantial resources as the empire's administrative apparatus expanded to handle increasingly complex governmental functions. Thousands of clerks, accountants, messengers, and officials required salaries, office space, and supplies to maintain the records and correspondence that kept the empire functioning. The emperor served as the ultimate supervisor of this bureaucratic machine, reviewing personnel decisions and approving expenditures for everything from papyrus and ink to the construction of new government buildings. Currency debasement became an increasingly attractive solution to budget shortfalls as emperors discovered they could increase the money supply by reducing the silver content of coins. This practice provided short-term relief from financial pressures, but created long-term inflation that undermined economic stability throughout the empire. The Emperor Septimius Severus reduced the silver content of the denarius from 83% to 60%, generating immediate revenue but triggering price increases that persisted for decades. The emperor's daily routine reflected the crushing weight of these administrative responsibilities as he struggled to process the enormous volume of information and decisions required to govern the empire. Each morning brought stacks of correspondence from provincial governors, military commanders, tax collectors, and local officials reporting on conditions throughout the Roman world. The emperor had to read these reports personally, since delegating such sensitive information to subordinates created security risks and reduced his direct knowledge of imperial affairs. Legal appeals consumed additional hours as Roman citizens exercised their right to petition the emperor directly for justice in cases involving capital punishment, property disputes, and conflicts with local authorities. The emperor served as the supreme court of the Roman legal system, and his decisions established precedents that influenced judicial proceedings throughout the empire. These cases required careful study of complex legal arguments and detailed knowledge of Roman law, yet the emperor had to render judgments quickly to prevent the accumulation of backlogs that could undermine confidence in imperial justice. Military reports demanded immediate attention since delays in responding to frontier emergencies could result in devastating barbarian raids or the loss of entire provinces to rebellion. The emperor had to evaluate requests for reinforcements, approve strategic plans, and coordinate operations across multiple frontiers simultaneously. This military oversight required detailed maps, intelligence reports, and constant communication with field commanders who might be facing imminent attack while waiting for imperial authorization to respond. Diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers, tribal chieftains, and client kings required equally careful attention, since misunderstandings could trigger wars that would consume enormous resources and destabilize entire regions. The emperor personally reviewed treaties, trade agreements, and territorial arrangements that affected relationships with Parthia, Germanic tribes, and the various kingdoms that bordered Roman territory. These negotiations often involved complex exchanges of hostages, tribute payments, and territorial concessions that required precise legal language and careful consideration of long-term strategic implications. The physical toll of this administrative burden manifested in the declining health of many emperors who aged rapidly under the stress of constant decision-making and sleep deprivation. Marcus Aurelius, despite his philosophical training and personal discipline, suffered from chronic stomach problems and insomnia that were almost certainly related to the pressures of imperial administration. His personal writings reveal a man struggling to maintain his equanimity while confronting an endless stream of crises that demanded immediate attention and perfect judgment. The crushing administrative burden that consumed Marcus Aurelius's final years paled in comparison to the military nightmares that plagued every emperor who wore the purple. While the philosopher-emperor struggled with correspondence and legal appeals in his palace study, his real existential threat came from the 28 legions scattered across the empire's vast frontiers, each containing approximately 5,000 battle-hardened professional soldiers whose loyalty could shift with devastating speed. These weren't citizen militias who returned to their farms after brief campaigns, but career warriors who had sworn personal oaths to their commanders and developed fierce unit loyalties that often superseded their allegiance to distant emperors they might never see. The empire's military structure had evolved into a strategic paradox that threatened every ruler who attempted to manage it. Rome needed competent generals to defend its 4,000-mile frontier against Germanic tribes pressing across the Rhine, Dacian raiders sweeping down from the Carpathian Mountains, and Parthian armies threatening the eastern provinces. Yet these same competent commanders, leading veteran legions in successful campaigns far from Rome, inevitably accumulated the military prestige and soldier loyalty that made them potential rivals for imperial power. The emperor faced an impossible choice: appoint incompetent generals who would lose battles and invite barbarian invasions, or select capable commanders who might eventually march their legions against Rome itself. This dilemma had already manifested repeatedly throughout imperial history, creating a pattern of military rebellion that no emperor could ignore. Vespasian had used his command of the Eastern legions to overthrow Vitellius in 69 CE, demonstrating how provincial armies could successfully challenge central authority. Septimius Severus had marched from Pannonia to defeat Didius Julianus and claim the throne, proving that frontier commanders possessed both the military strength and logistical capability to capture Rome. Every emperor understood that his own rise to power might serve as a template for ambitious subordinates commanding distant legions. The financial burden of maintaining military loyalty consumed approximately 3/4 of the imperial budget and created constant pressure for new sources of revenue. Each legion required not only regular monthly pay for its soldiers, but also substantial bonuses upon the accession of new emperors, additional payments for successful campaigns, and expensive retirement benefits including land grants and monetary settlements. The Praetorian Guard, stationed in Rome itself, demanded even higher compensation due to their privileged position and political importance. These costs were fixed and non-negotiable since unpaid soldiers invariably mutinied, often proclaiming rival emperors who promised better treatment. The mathematics of military finance revealed the crushing burden placed on imperial resources. A single legion's annual payroll exceeded 2 million sestertii, not including bonuses, equipment, supplies, and veteran benefits. Multiplied across 28 legions, plus auxiliary units, naval forces, and the Praetorian Guard, military expenses approached 200 million sestertii annually during peacetime. Active campaigns doubled or tripled these costs as armies required additional supplies, siege equipment, and hazard pay for soldiers facing combat. The Emperor Trajan's Dacian wars consumed an estimated 650 million sestertii over 6 years, representing nearly 3 years' worth of total imperial revenue. These enormous expenses forced emperors to seek new sources of income through taxation, confiscation, and currency debasement, policies that inevitably generated resentment among the wealthy classes whose support was essential for political stability. Senators and equestrians, who faced increased tax assessments to fund military bonuses, often channeled their anger into support for rival claimants who promised fiscal restraint. The emperor found himself trapped between soldiers demanding payment and civilians resenting the taxes required to satisfy military needs. The geographic distribution of legions created additional strategic nightmares as emperors struggled to prevent any single commander from accumulating excessive military strength while maintaining adequate defenses along multiple threatened frontiers. The Rhine frontier required 8 legions to contain Germanic pressure, while the Danube needed 6 more to guard against Dacian and Sarmatian raids. The eastern provinces demanded 4 legions to face Parthian threats, and Britain absorbed 3 legions for operations against unconquered tribes. Egypt, Africa, and Spain each required at least 1 legion for internal security and frontier defense. This distribution meant that several provincial commanders controlled multiple legions, giving them military forces comparable to those available to the emperor in Italy. The governor of Germania Superior commanded 4 legions totaling approximately 20,000 soldiers, while his colleague in Germania Inferior controlled another 4 legions. These commanders possessed not only substantial military strength, but also detailed knowledge of Roman tactical methods, supply systems, and strategic weaknesses that would prove invaluable in any rebellion against imperial authority. The emperor's attempts to rotate these commands to prevent excessive accumulation of personal loyalty often backfired by creating instability and resentment among both officers and soldiers. Legions developed strong attachments to successful commanders who led them to victory and ensured regular pay and bonuses. Arbitrary transfers of popular generals triggered mutinies and protests that could escalate into full rebellion if handled poorly. The Emperor Galba discovered this danger when he attempted to transfer the popular commander Vitellius from the Rhine legions, sparking a revolt that ultimately cost Galba his life and throne. The loyalty of individual legions depended heavily on their recent experiences and the personal relationships between soldiers and their immediate commanders. Veterans who had served under the same general for multiple campaigns developed fierce personal loyalty that often superseded their abstract allegiance to distant emperors. These bonds were strengthened by shared hardships, successful battles, and the general's ability to secure favorable treatment for his troops. A commander who consistently obtained bonuses, leave time, and choice postings for his soldiers could count on their support even in rebellions against legitimate imperial authority. The 14th Legion Gemina exemplified this pattern of personal loyalty during the Year of the Four Emperors. These soldiers had served under Otho during his brief reign and developed strong attachment to their commander despite his ultimate defeat. When Vitellius attempted to transfer the legion to Britain, the soldiers mutinied and declared their continued loyalty to Otho's memory. Only the intervention of Vespasian's agents, who promised better treatment under the new emperor, prevented the legion from marching on Rome independently. Intelligence gathering about potential military disloyalty presented another layer of complexity that consumed enormous imperial resources while providing questionable results. The emperor needed to monitor the activities and communications of dozens of provincial commanders, each controlling thousands of armed men in regions far from central oversight. This surveillance required networks of spies, informants, and loyal officers who who could report on suspicious activities, unauthorized troop movements, and seditious conversations among military personnel. The speculators who served as the emperor's military intelligence agents operated under extremely dangerous conditions as they attempted to penetrate the tight-knit communities of professional soldiers who were naturally suspicious of outsiders. These agents had to maintain careful cover identities while gathering information about troop morale, commander loyalty, and potential rebellion plans. Discovery meant certain death, often preceded by torture, as angry soldiers extracted information about other imperial spies operating in their ranks. The information gathered through these networks often proved contradictory or unreliable, as commanders learned to feed false intelligence to suspected imperial agents while concealing their true intentions. Ambitious generals could manipulate the spy networks to their advantage by spreading disinformation about their rivals while concealing their own preparations for rebellion. The emperor received constant reports of suspicious activities, unauthorized meetings, and seditious statements, but determining which intelligence represented genuine threats required investigative resources that rarely existed. The Emperor Domitian's obsessive monitoring of military commanders exemplified both the necessity and futility of these intelligence efforts. The emperor maintained detailed files on every legion commander, tracking their backgrounds, family connections, financial status, and political associations. He regularly rotated assignments to prevent excessive familiarity between generals and their troops, while placing trusted agents throughout the military hierarchy to report on suspicious activities. Despite these elaborate precautions, Domitian ultimately fell victim to a conspiracy that included his own Praetorian prefect, demonstrating the limitations of even the most comprehensive surveillance systems. The timing of military rebellions often caught emperors unprepared despite their intelligence networks, because ambitious commanders could exploit the empire's communication delays to achieve strategic surprise. A general commanding legions in Britain or Syria could begin preparations for rebellion months before news of his activities reached Rome, using this time advantage to secure additional support, accumulate supplies, and coordinate with potential allies in other provinces. By the time the emperor learned of the threat, the rebel commander might already be marching toward Italy with a substantial army. The rebellion of Avidius Cassius in 175 CE demonstrated how quickly military situations could deteriorate despite imperial vigilance. Cassius commanded the Eastern legions during Marcus Aurelius's campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier. When false reports reached Syria claiming that Marcus Aurelius had died in battle, Cassius allowed himself to be proclaimed emperor by his troops, who feared that the empire would descend into civil war without clear leadership. The rebellion gained momentum rapidly as other Eastern commanders joined the movement, creating a substantial military threat that required immediate imperial response. Marcus Aurelius learned of Cassius's rebellion only when messengers reached his headquarters on the Danube, weeks after the Eastern legions had already declared their allegiance to the usurper. The emperor faced a strategic nightmare as he was forced to abandon his Germanic campaigns at a critical moment to deal with the Eastern rebellion, leaving the northern frontier vulnerable to barbarian raids while marching his armies across the empire to confront Cassius. The rebellion ultimately collapsed when Cassius was assassinated by his own subordinates, but the incident revealed how quickly military situations could spiral beyond imperial control. The logistical challenges of suppressing military rebellions strained imperial resources and often created new vulnerabilities in other regions. Moving legions from one frontier to another required enormous expenditures for transportation, supplies, and temporary fortifications, while leaving the abandoned sectors exposed to enemy attack. The emperor had to calculate whether the threat posed by rebellious commanders justified the risks created by weakening other defensive positions, a calculation that often proved impossible to make with limited information and time pressure. The speed of military movements during rebellions often surprised emperors accustomed to the slower pace of normal administrative communications. rebel armies could march 20-25 miles per day under forced march conditions, covering the distance from the Rhine to Rome in approximately 6 weeks if they encountered no significant opposition. This rapid movement left little time for imperial countermeasures, as loyal legions had to be mobilized, supplied, and positioned to intercept the rebels before they reached Italy. The emperor's personal military capabilities became crucial factors in these confrontations, as soldiers expected their commanders to demonstrate competence in planning campaigns and leading troops in battle. Emperors who lacked military experience or who appeared weak in the face of rebellion often found their own legions wavering in their loyalty, creating cascading failures that could transform minor revolts into empire-threatening civil wars. The Emperor Galba's hesitant response to Vitellius's rebellion contributed to the rapid collapse of his regime, as soldiers lost confidence in his ability to provide effective leadership. The psychological pressure of commanding military operations while simultaneously managing the empire's civilian administration created enormous stress for emperors who had to make life and death decisions about deployment, strategy, and resource allocation under extreme time pressure. These decisions affected not only the immediate military situation, but also the empire's long-term strategic position, as failed responses to rebellions could encourage additional uprisings by demonstrating imperial weakness. The emperor's relationship with the Praetorian Guard added another layer of complexity to military management, as these elite troops possessed both the opportunity and capability to eliminate emperors who lost their confidence. The Guard's proximity to the emperor in Rome meant they could observe his reactions to military crises firsthand, evaluating his competence and resolve in real time. Emperors who appeared panicked or indecisive when confronting military rebellions risked losing Praetorian support, which often proved fatal given the Guard's access to the imperial palace and person. The financial cost of suppressing military rebellions often exceeded the expenses of the original conflicts that triggered them, as emperors had to offer substantial bonuses to secure loyalty from wavering legions, while simultaneously funding the logistics of rapid military movements across vast distances. These emergency expenditures strained imperial budgets that were already stretched by normal military expenses, forcing emperors to implement emergency taxation or currency debasement that generated additional political opposition. The imperial adoption system that Augustus established to ensure orderly succession instead created a labyrinthine web of competing claims and murderous rivalries that would plague the empire for centuries. Unlike the straightforward hereditary monarchies that dominated other ancient civilizations, Roman imperial succession operated through a complex mixture of adoption, marriage alliances, and military backing that transformed every imperial household into a potential battleground where blood relatives plotted against each other with deadly precision. The Julio-Claudian dynasty exemplified how imperial adoption could generate rather than resolve succession crises. Augustus himself had no surviving sons, forcing him to adopt his stepson Tiberius after a series of earlier choices had died under suspicious circumstances. Tiberius, already middle-aged when he assumed power, had been Augustus's third choice for succession, selected only after the deaths of Marcellus, Agrippa, and the emperor's grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar. This pattern of elimination continued throughout Tiberius's reign as potential heirs disappeared through assassination, suicide, or convenient accidents that cleared the path for Caligula's eventual succession. The adoption process itself created artificial family relationships that lacked the natural bonds of blood kinship, while simultaneously generating legal claims to imperial power that could be enforced through military action. Adopted sons possessed the same theoretical rights as biological children, but they often harbored resentment against their adoptive families and competed viciously with other adopted siblings for imperial favor. These artificial family structures produced individuals with legitimate claims to succession, but no emotional investment in preserving family unity, creating ideal conditions for fratricidal violence. Nero's relationship with his adoptive father Claudius demonstrated how adoption could facilitate rather than prevent imperial murder. Agrippina the Younger had maneuvered her son's adoption by Claudius through marriage and political manipulation, positioning Nero ahead of Claudius's biological son Britannicus in the succession. Once Claudius died, allegedly poisoned by Agrippina herself, Nero moved quickly to eliminate Britannicus before the younger prince could challenge his claim. The assassination occurred during a family dinner when Nero's agents poisoned Britannicus's wine, causing the 14-year-old to collapse and die while his adoptive brother watched with apparent indifference. The murder of Britannicus revealed the cold calculation that characterized imperial family relationships. Nero had grown up alongside his victim, sharing tutors, meals, and living quarters in Claudius's palace. Yet these shared experiences created no bonds of affection or loyalty that could overcome the political necessity of eliminating a potential rival. Britannicus's death was witnessed by dozens of dinner guests, including his own sister Octavia, but no one dared protest as the emperor's agents removed the body and announced that the prince had suffered an epileptic seizure. The systematic elimination of potential rivals within imperial families followed predictable patterns that reflected the paranoid logic of dynastic politics. Emperors typically began by targeting the most obvious threats, male relatives with strong claims to succession, before expanding their purges to include more distant family members who might serve as focal points for opposition conspiracies. These killings often occurred during family gatherings or religious ceremonies when the victims' guards would be relaxed and their deaths could be attributed to natural causes or accidents. Caligula's reign demonstrated how quickly imperial paranoia could consume entire family networks. The emperor ordered the execution of his cousin Gemellus, whom Tiberius had named as co-heir, within months of assuming power. He then systematically eliminated other potential rivals, including his brother-in-law Marcus Lepidus, and his own sisters Agrippina and Julia Livilla, whom he accused of plotting against him. These family murders were often preceded by elaborate trials, where the emperor presented fabricated evidence of treason, while forcing other relatives to participate in the condemnation of their own family members. The burden of producing legitimate heirs while navigating the political implications of marriage alliances created additional layers of stress for emperors who understood that their choice of wife could determine the empire's future. Imperial marriages were never private affairs, but complex political arrangements that affected relationships with senatorial families, provincial elites, and military commanders throughout the Roman world. The emperor's wife became a powerful political figure in her own right, often wielding influence over appointments, policy decisions, and succession planning that could threaten the emperor's own authority. The case of Messalina, Claudius's third wife, illustrated how imperial marriages could generate rather than resolve political problems. Messalina came from one of Rome's most prestigious families, bringing valuable political connections that initially strengthened Claudius's position among the senatorial elite. However, her ambition and sexual appetite soon created scandals that undermined imperial dignity, while her political meddling generated powerful enemies throughout the government. Her alleged marriage to Gaius Silius, while still wed to Claudius, provided the emperor's freedmen advisors with the pretext they needed to eliminate her as a threat to their own influence. Messalina's execution in 48 CE required Claudius to choose between his wife and his political survival, a decision that revealed the impossible personal costs of imperial power. The emperor had genuinely loved Messalina and had celebrated the birth of their children Britannicus and Octavia as proof of divine favor for his reign. Yet when his advisors presented evidence of her alleged bigamy and treason, Claudius understood that defending his wife would be interpreted as weakness that could encourage additional challenges to his authority. The execution was carried out while Claudius was dining, and palace sources reported that the emperor seemed unaware that his wife had been killed until several hours after her death. The emperor's choice of a new wife after Messalina's death demonstrated how personal grief had to be subordinated to political calculation in imperial decision-making. Claudius's advisors presented him with three candidates: Lalia Paulina, who offered connections to the eastern provinces, Calpurnia, who represented traditional Roman aristocracy, and Agrippina the Younger, who brought the prestige of the Julio-Claudian bloodline along with her son Nero. Each choice carried different political implications and risks, forcing Claudius to evaluate potential marriage partners like military alliances rather than romantic relationships. Agrippina's selection as Claudius's fourth wife proved catastrophic for both the emperor and the imperial system itself. Her primary qualification was her ability to provide a male heir with impeccable Julio-Claudian credentials, as Nero was the great-great-grandson of Augustus through both his maternal and paternal lineages. However, Agrippina's political ambitions and ruthless pursuit of power for her son created a toxic dynamic within the imperial household that ultimately consumed both Claudius and Britannicus, while elevating one of Rome's most unstable rulers to supreme power. The political implications of imperial marriage extended beyond the immediate family to encompass the broader network of relatives, clients, and supporters that each spouse brought to the imperial court. A new empress could elevate her family members to positions of influence while marginalizing the emperor's existing advisors and allies. These shifts in court politics often triggered broader realignments throughout the government as officials scrambled to curry favor with the new power structure while protecting themselves from potential purges. Agrippina's influence over Claudius manifested in a series of appointments and policy changes that favored her supporters while systematically eliminating potential obstacles to Nero's succession. She secured the recall of Seneca from exile to serve as Nero's tutor, positioning one of Rome's most skilled rhetoricians and philosophers to shape her son's education and political development. She also maneuvered the appointment of Afranius Burrus as Praetorian prefect, ensuring that the emperor's personal bodyguard would support Nero's eventual succession. The tragic pattern of promising heirs dying young or being corrupted by power created additional succession crises that forced emperors to make increasingly desperate choices about dynastic continuity. The Roman climate and primitive medical knowledge meant that childhood mortality remained high even among the imperial elite, while the political pressures of court life often proved psychologically devastating for young princes who understood that their survival depended on maintaining their father's favor while avoiding the jealousy of potential rivals. Germanicus, Tiberius's nephew and adopted son, exemplified the promise and tragedy of imperial heirs who died before reaching maturity. Widely regarded as the most capable military commander of his generation, Germanicus had won spectacular victories against Germanic tribes while maintaining the loyalty of his legions and the affection of the Roman people. His death in Syria in 19 CE, allegedly from poisoning ordered by Tiberius himself, eliminated what many considered the empire's best hope for competent leadership, while generating conspiracy theories that poisoned relationships within the imperial family for decades. The suspicious circumstances surrounding Germanicus's death reflected the paranoid atmosphere that pervaded imperial succession planning. Tiberius had grown increasingly resentful of his nephew's popularity and military success, fearing that Germanicus might use his prestige to challenge imperial authority. When Germanicus fell ill during his eastern command, rumors immediately circulated that the emperor had ordered his elimination to clear the succession for his own biological son Drusus. These accusations were never proven, but they created lasting resentment among Germanicus's supporters and contributed to the political instability that characterized the later years of Tiberius's reign. The corruption of imperial heirs by premature exposure to absolute power created equally serious problems for succession planning, as emperors watched their chosen successors develop the character flaws that would make them unsuitable rulers. Young princes raised in the imperial palace grew up surrounded by flatterers and sycophants who encouraged their worst impulses while shielding them from the consequences of their actions. This environment often produced individuals who combined unlimited authority with emotional immaturity, creating potential tyrants whose accession could threaten the empire's stability. Caligula's transformation from a beloved young prince to a murderous tyrant illustrated how the imperial environment could corrupt even initially promising heirs. As a child, he had been the darling of the Rhine legions, who nicknamed him Little Boots for the miniature military uniform he wore while visiting his father Germanicus's camps. His early years suggested a future ruler who would combine military competence with popular appeal, qualities that seemed ideal for imperial leadership. However, his upbringing in Tiberius's increasingly paranoid court exposed him to constant violence and intrigue that apparently warped his psychological development. The emperor's attempts to prepare heirs for the responsibilities of imperial power often backfired by creating rivals who possessed dangerous knowledge about government operations while lacking the emotional maturity to handle such information responsibly. Young princes who participated in policy discussions and military planning gained insights into imperial weaknesses and strategic vulnerabilities that could prove devastating if they eventually rebelled against their adoptive fathers. The emperor faced an impossible choice between excluding potential heirs from meaningful participation in government, which left them unprepared for leadership, or including them in sensitive decisions that could facilitate future coups. Marcus Aurelius confronted this dilemma when preparing his biological son Commodus for eventual succession. The philosopher-emperor understood that Commodus lacked both the intellectual capacity and emotional stability required for effective leadership, yet the principle of dynastic succession seemed to require the transfer of power to his only surviving male heir. Marcus Aurelius attempted to compensate for his son's deficiencies by surrounding him with capable advisors and gradually introducing him to imperial responsibilities under careful supervision. These efforts proved futile as Commodus demonstrated increasing instability and cruelty even during his father's lifetime. The young prince showed little interest in the philosophical studies that had shaped Marcus Aurelius's approach to leadership, preferring gladiatorial combat and other violent entertainments that alarmed court observers. His participation in actual gladiatorial contests, including fights against handicapped opponents and wild animals, suggested a psychological instability that would prove catastrophic once he gained unlimited imperial authority. The pressure to produce male heirs capable of continuing dynastic lines created additional stress for emperors whose wives failed to bear sons or whose children died in infancy. The Roman emphasis on patrilineal succession meant that daughters, regardless of their capabilities, could not directly inherit imperial power, forcing emperors to rely on adoption, marriage alliances, or other expedients to ensure dynastic continuity. This limitation often resulted in the elevation of unsuitable male relatives or the adoption of individuals with questionable qualifications simply because they possessed the correct gender and bloodline credentials. The Emperor Nerva faced this crisis when he assumed power at age 66 without any surviving children or obvious heirs. His advanced age meant that natural reproduction was unlikely, forcing him to identify and adopt a suitable successor who could maintain political stability while commanding military respect. His choice of Trajan, a successful general commanding the Rhine legions, proved inspired and established a precedent for merit-based adoption that would characterize the Antonine dynasty. However, Nerva's decision also demonstrated the arbitrary nature of imperial succession, as the empire's future depended entirely on the personal judgment of an elderly emperor who might have selected any number of different candidates. The adoption of adult heirs created its own complications, as mature men with established careers and loyalties were suddenly thrust into artificial family relationships that demanded absolute obedience to their adoptive fathers. These arrangements often generated resentment and conflict as adopted sons struggled to balance their existing obligations with their new roles as imperial heirs. The artificial nature of these relationships meant that personal affection rarely developed between adoptive fathers and sons, creating succession arrangements based purely on political calculation rather than family bonds. Hadrian's relationship with his first adopted heir, Lucius Aelius Caesar, exemplified the tensions inherent in adult adoption arrangements. Aelius was a relatively obscure senator whose primary qualifications were his good looks and lack of powerful enemies rather than any demonstrated administrative or military competence. Hadrian's selection appeared arbitrary to contemporary observers and generated resentment among more qualified candidates who had been passed over for adoption. When Aelius died suddenly in 138 CE, many suspected that he had been poisoned by rivals who refused to accept his elevation to heir apparent. The emperor's subsequent adoption of Antoninus Pius, who was then required to adopt both Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as his own heirs, created a complex succession arrangement that attempted to ensure dynastic stability for multiple generations. This elaborate planning reflected Hadrian's understanding that imperial succession required careful preparation and broad political acceptance, yet it also demonstrated the artificial and potentially unstable nature of adoption-based dynasties. The success of this arrangement depended entirely on the personal compatibility and political cooperation of individuals who had been thrust together by imperial decree rather than natural family relationships. The military implications of dynastic succession created additional pressures, as emperors understood that their chosen heirs would need to command the respect and loyalty of professional soldiers who valued competence over bloodline credentials. The Roman army's corporate culture emphasized merit, courage, and leadership ability, qualities that could not be inherited through adoption or marriage, but had to be demonstrated through actual military service. Imperial heirs who lacked military experience or who appeared weak in the face of battlefield challenges risked losing army support that was essential for maintaining imperial authority. The divine honors that Roman emperors were expected to accept created a psychological burden that would have challenged even the most mentally stable individuals. Yet these same rulers had to navigate this spiritual minefield while dealing with very human problems like chronic illness, family betrayals, and military disasters. The imperial cult that Augustus had carefully established as a political tool gradually evolved into a religious straitjacket that trapped his successors between the impossible demands of godlike perfection and the harsh realities of mortal limitations. The process of deification began subtly during an emperor's lifetime through the construction of temples dedicated to his genius or divine spirit, the establishment of priesthoods responsible for his worship, and the minting of coins bearing divine symbols alongside his portrait. Provincial cities competed to demonstrate their loyalty by erecting increasingly elaborate shrines where local populations could offer sacrifices and prayers to the living emperor. These ceremonies weren't merely symbolic gestures, but genuine religious observances where participants believed they were communicating with divine powers capable of influencing their daily lives. The emperor's physical presence at these religious ceremonies created surreal situations where mortal men were forced to accept worship from crowds of believers who prostrated themselves and offered prayers for divine intervention. Caligula reportedly enjoyed these moments of adoration, encouraging increasingly elaborate displays of reverence that included golden statues, precious offerings, and elaborate rituals borrowed from Eastern mystery religions. However, even Caligula struggled with the cognitive dissonance of being worshipped as a god while suffering from the stomach ailments, insomnia, and emotional instability that plagued his daily existence. The practical impossibility of living up to divine expectations became apparent whenever emperors faced military defeats, natural disasters, or political crises that revealed their human limitations. When plague swept through the empire during Marcus Aurelius's reign, killing thousands of citizens who had prayed to the emperor for divine protection, the philosopher-emperor faced awkward questions about his apparent inability to prevent suffering among his worshippers. The Antonine Plague, which modern scholars believe was likely smallpox, devastated entire provinces, while temples dedicated to Marcus Aurelius continued to receive offerings from desperate families seeking divine intervention. The emperor's response to these challenges required careful calibration between maintaining divine authority and acknowledging human limitations without completely undermining the imperial cult's credibility. Marcus Aurelius addressed this dilemma by emphasizing his role as an intermediary between the traditional gods and mortal humanity, rather than claiming direct divine powers. His personal writings reveal a man struggling to reconcile his Stoic philosophical beliefs with the religious expectations placed upon him by millions of subjects who genuinely believed in his divine nature. The religious politics of managing competing spiritual traditions throughout the empire created additional layers of complexity that consumed enormous amounts of imperial time and energy. Rome's traditional polytheistic system had always accommodated foreign deities through syncretism and adaptation, but the empire's vast size meant that emperors now had to balance the religious sensibilities of Egyptian priests worshipping Isis, Germanic tribes honoring Wotan, Celtic druids practicing human sacrifice, Persian followers of Mithras, and Jewish communities maintaining strict monotheism. Each religious tradition carried political implications that extended far beyond spiritual matters. The Egyptian priesthood controlled vast temple complexes that served as economic centers, banks, and landowners, whose cooperation was essential for maintaining stability in Rome's primary grain-producing province. Germanic religious practices were intimately connected to tribal identity and military culture, making any interference with traditional ceremonies a potential trigger for rebellion along the Rhine frontier. Celtic druids in Gaul and Britain served as political leaders and judges whose religious authority reinforced resistance to Roman rule. The emperor's attempts to standardize religious practices often backfired by creating resentment among local populations, who interpreted such policies as attacks on their cultural identity. Claudius's prohibition of Druidism in Gaul was motivated primarily by political concerns about Celtic resistance rather than religious objections. Yet his enforcement of this ban required military operations that consumed substantial resources while generating lasting hostility among Gallic tribes. The Druids simply moved their operations to Britain and Ireland, where they continued to provide ideological support for anti-Roman movements. The rise of mystery cults throughout the empire presented additional challenges as these exclusive religious societies developed their own hierarchies, initiation rituals, and secret doctrines that operated independently of imperial control. The cult of Mithras became particularly popular among Roman soldiers, creating a parallel religious structure within the military that could potentially be used to organize resistance against imperial authority. Mithraic temples, built underground and accessible only to initiated members, provided meeting places where soldiers could gather without official oversight. The emperor's relationship with these mystery cults required delicate navigation between tolerance and control. Suppressing popular religious movements risked alienating military units and civilian populations, whose loyalty was essential for imperial stability, yet allowing completely independent religious organizations to flourish created potential networks for political opposition. Trajan addressed this challenge by participating in Mithraic ceremonies himself, demonstrating imperial approval while maintaining oversight of the cult's activities and leadership. The Jewish population presented unique challenges for imperial religious policy due to their strict monotheism and refusal to participate in emperor worship or traditional Roman religious ceremonies. Unlike other subject peoples who could easily accommodate imperial deities alongside their traditional gods, Jews viewed emperor worship as blasphemous idolatry that violated fundamental religious principles. This theological incompatibility created persistent tensions that periodically erupted into violent rebellions, requiring massive military interventions. The Emperor Hadrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina, complete with temples dedicated to Jupiter and himself, triggered the Bar Kokhba revolt that consumed 3 years and required the deployment of 12 legions to suppress. The rebellion's ferocity reflected not merely political resistance, but genuine religious outrage among Jews who viewed Hadrian's actions as deliberate desecration of their holiest sites. The emperor's failure to anticipate this religious dimension of the conflict demonstrated how imperial religious policies could generate unexpected military crises. The emergence of Christianity during the 1st century CE created an even more complex religious challenge, as this new faith combined Jewish monotheism with active proselytizing that attracted converts throughout the empire. Unlike Judaism, which remained largely confined to ethnic Jewish communities, Christianity actively sought Gentile converts and developed organizational structures that transcended traditional ethnic and geographic boundaries. Christian communities established their own bishops, developed distinctive theological doctrines, and created social networks that operated independently of imperial control. The emperor's response to Christianity evolved gradually from initial indifference to periodic persecution as the movement's growth began to threaten traditional religious practices and imperial authority. Nero's persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE was motivated primarily by the need to deflect blame for the disaster rather than systematic religious opposition. However, later emperors like Domitian and Decius implemented more comprehensive anti-Christian policies as they recognized the faith's potential to undermine the imperial cult and traditional Roman values. The practical enforcement of anti-Christian measures created administrative nightmares as imperial officials struggled to identify believers who could easily conceal their faith when necessary. Unlike Jews, who were identifiable through circumcision, dietary laws, and synagogue attendance, Christians could blend seamlessly into the general population while maintaining their religious beliefs in secret. This invisibility made systematic persecution nearly impossible, while creating an atmosphere of suspicion and denunciation that poisoned relationships throughout Roman society. The Emperor Trajan's correspondence with Pliny the Younger regarding Christian persecution in Bithynia revealed the arbitrary and inconsistent nature of imperial religious policy. Trajan instructed Pliny not to seek out Christians actively, but to punish those who were formally accused and refused to recant their faith. This policy created a system where personal enemies could destroy rivals through religious denunciations, while allowing most Christians to practice their faith without interference as long as they avoided public attention. The psychological strain of managing these competing religious demands while maintaining personal spiritual beliefs created enormous stress for emperors who had to compartmentalize their private convictions from their public religious obligations. Marcus Aurelius's personal adherence to Stoic philosophy conflicted with his official role as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Roman state religion, who was responsible for maintaining traditional ceremonies and interpreting divine omens. His philosophical writings reveal a man struggling to find meaning in rituals he privately considered meaningless while understanding their political necessity. The emperor's participation in traditional Roman religious ceremonies required extensive preparation and careful attention to ritual details that could consume entire days while producing no tangible benefits for imperial administration. The complex calendar of religious festivals meant that emperors spent substantial portions of their time performing sacrifices, interpreting omens, and presiding over ceremonies that had been established centuries earlier when Rome was a small city-state rather than a vast empire. These obligations could not be delegated to subordinates without undermining the emperor's religious authority and suggesting weakness or impiety. The interpretation of omens and portents placed additional pressure on emperors who were expected to demonstrate divine insight while making practical decisions based on rational analysis of political and military factors. When unfavorable omens appeared before important battles or policy decisions, the emperor faced impossible choices between following religious tradition and pursuing strategic objectives. Ignoring negative omens risked alienating traditional Romans who believed in divine intervention, while postponing military operations based on bird flights or lightning patterns could result in strategic disasters. The Emperor Claudius exemplified these religious contradictions as he combined genuine scholarly interest in traditional Roman religion with pragmatic political calculations about religious policy. His extensive writings on Etruscan religious practices demonstrated deep knowledge of ancient divination techniques, yet his decisions about religious matters were clearly influenced by political considerations rather than spiritual conviction. His deification of his predecessor Caligula, despite knowing the deceased emperor's mental instability and criminal behavior, revealed how religious decisions served political purposes rather than genuine theological principles. The pressure to achieve posthumous deification created additional stress for living emperors, who understood that their chances of divine honors depended largely on their successors' political needs, rather than their actual accomplishments or character. The Senate's decision to deify deceased emperors was influenced by complex political calculations about legitimacy, continuity, and the new ruler's relationship with his predecessor's supporters. Emperors who died violently or were overthrown by military coups rarely received divine honors regardless of their achievements, while mediocrities like Claudius were deified because their successors needed to legitimize their own reigns. The precedent established by Augustus's deification created expectations that subsequent emperors would achieve similar honors through increasingly grandiose projects and expensive public works that demonstrated their worthiness for divine status. The construction of massive temples, elaborate public baths, spectacular amphitheaters, and monumental forums became competitive displays where each emperor attempted to surpass his predecessor's achievements while bankrupting the imperial treasury. These projects consumed resources that could have been used for military equipment, infrastructure maintenance, or economic development, yet emperors felt compelled to pursue them as investments in their posthumous reputations. Trajan's Forum, which cost an estimated 200 million sestertii and required the excavation of an entire hillside in central Rome, exemplified this competitive monumentalism that prioritized imperial legacy over practical governance. The project employed thousands of workers for over 8 years, while consuming revenues that could have funded multiple military campaigns or infrastructure projects throughout the empire. Yet Trajan understood that this architectural achievement would serve as a permanent reminder of his reign's prosperity and success, potentially influencing the Senate's decision about his eventual deification. The emperor's personal religious beliefs often conflicted with the political requirements of imperial religious policy, creating internal tensions that manifested in inconsistent decisions and erratic behavior. Emperors who privately favored philosophical schools like Stoicism or Epicureanism found themselves obligated to participate in traditional religious ceremonies that contradicted their personal convictions about the nature of divinity and human purpose. This cognitive dissonance was particularly acute for intellectually sophisticated rulers like Marcus Aurelius, who understood the philosophical problems inherent in emperor worship while recognizing its political necessity. The daily routine of imperial religious obligations included morning sacrifices, consultation of auguries before important decisions, participation in seasonal festivals, and oversight of priestly appointments throughout the empire. These activities required substantial time and attention that could have been devoted to administrative or military matters, yet neglecting religious duties would have been interpreted as impiety that could undermine imperial authority. The emperor found himself trapped in a schedule of ceremonial obligations that served no practical purpose while consuming resources needed for actual governance. The establishment of imperial cult centers throughout the provinces created additional administrative burdens, as emperors had to approve architectural plans, fund construction projects, and appoint priests for temples dedicated to their own worship. These facilities required ongoing maintenance, regular festivals, and periodic visits from imperial representatives to maintain their religious and political significance. The emperor's correspondence files filled with reports about temple repairs, priestly disputes, and ceremonial preparations that demanded immediate attention despite their minimal impact on imperial policy. The financial costs of maintaining imperial religious obligations strained budgets that were already stretched by military expenses and administrative overhead. The emperor was expected to fund elaborate sacrifices involving hundreds of animals, expensive offerings of gold and silver objects, and spectacular public festivals that demonstrated divine favor and imperial generosity. These expenditures were considered essential investments in political stability, yet they diverted resources from infrastructure projects and military equipment that would have provided more tangible benefits for imperial security and economic development. The crushing weight of religious obligations that consumed Marcus Aurelius's daily schedule paled in comparison to the financial catastrophes that awaited every emperor who inherited the purple. While the philosopher-emperor performed morning sacrifices and consulted auguries, the imperial treasury hemorrhaged money at rates that would have bankrupted most modern nations within months. The Roman Empire operated on a scale of expenditure that defied rational economic planning, where single construction projects consumed more resources than entire provinces generated in annual revenue, and military campaigns could drain decades of accumulated wealth in a matter of seasons. The inherited financial crises that greeted new emperors represented perhaps the most immediate and deadly threat to their survival, more dangerous than assassins lurking in palace corridors or rebellious legions marching from distant frontiers. Predecessors invariably left behind empty treasuries and massive debts accumulated through grandiose building projects, extravagant games, and military adventures that had seemed politically necessary at the time, but proved economically catastrophic in hindsight. Each new emperor faced the impossible choice between honoring his predecessor's financial commitments, which could bankrupt the state, or repudiating these obligations, which would destroy imperial credibility and trigger immediate political crises. Caligula inherited what appeared to be a substantial treasury surplus from Tiberius, who had accumulated approximately 2.7 billion sestertii through careful financial management and reduced public spending during his 23-year reign. This enormous sum represented nearly 3 years' worth of total imperial revenue, providing what should have been a comfortable financial cushion for the new emperor's initiatives. However, Caligula's extravagant spending on games, public works, and personal luxuries consumed this entire inheritance within a single year, forcing him to implement increasingly desperate measures to fund his continued expenditures. The speed with which Caligula depleted the imperial treasury revealed the crushing financial demands placed on emperors who were expected to demonstrate their generosity and divine favor through spectacular public displays. His gladiatorial games cost an estimated 100 million sestertii per event, while his construction of temporary bridges across the Bay of Naples for a single ceremonial procession consumed resources equivalent to the annual pay of 4 legions. These expenditures served no practical purpose beyond imperial self-aggrandizement, yet refusing to fund such spectacles would have been interpreted as weakness or impiety that could encourage political opposition. The emperor's financial obligations extended far beyond optional luxuries to include fixed costs that could not be reduced without triggering immediate military or civilian unrest. The grain dole that fed Rome's urban population required approximately 15 million modii of wheat annually, costing roughly 30 million sestertii in transportation, storage, and distribution expenses. Military payrolls consumed another 150 million sestertii yearly for legionary salaries alone, not including bonuses, equipment, and veteran benefits that could double these costs during active campaigns. Infrastructure maintenance for roads, aqueducts, and public buildings throughout the empire demanded additional tens of millions in annual expenditures that could not be deferred without risking economic collapse. Nero's reign demonstrated how inherited financial problems could escalate into empire-threatening crises when combined with additional imperial extravagance. The emperor inherited substantial debts from Claudius's expensive public works projects, including the massive harbor at Portus and the extension of aqueduct systems throughout central Italy. These inherited obligations already strained imperial finances before Nero began his own ambitious construction program, which included the Golden House, a sprawling palace complex that covered approximately 300 acres in central Rome and featured revolutionary architectural innovations like rotating dining rooms and artificial lakes. The Golden House's construction costs exceeded 200 million sestertii, requiring the confiscation of property from wealthy citizens and the implementation of new taxes that generated widespread resentment among the senatorial and equestrian classes. Nero's architects incorporated exotic materials, including rare marbles from Egypt, precious metals from Spain, and decorative elements that required specialized craftsmen from throughout the Mediterranean world. The project's scale was so vast that it displaced thousands of Roman families whose homes were demolished to make room for the palace gardens and artificial landscapes. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE transformed Nero's financial problems into an existential crisis that threatened the empire's stability. The fire destroyed approximately two-thirds of the city, including commercial districts, residential neighborhoods, and public buildings that represented centuries of accumulated wealth and infrastructure investment. The emperor faced enormous pressure to fund reconstruction efforts while simultaneously maintaining military commitments and continuing his own building projects. The estimated cost of rebuilding Rome approached 500 million sestertii, an amount that exceeded the empire's total annual revenue and forced Nero to implement increasingly desperate fundraising measures. The emperor's response to this financial crisis included systematic confiscation of property from wealthy citizens accused of treason, the introduction of new taxes on commercial transactions, and the debasement of silver currency that reduced the denarius's precious metal content by approximately 10%. These measures provided short-term relief, but created long-term economic instability as inflation began to erode the purchasing power of Roman currency, while property confiscations destroyed confidence in legal protections for private wealth. The inflationary spiral that resulted from currency debasement created a vicious cycle where emperors were forced to reduce silver content further to fund increasing expenses, while prices rose throughout the empire in response to the declining value of money. Septimius Severus inherited this problem from his predecessors and exacerbated it by reducing the denarius's silver content from 83% to 60% to fund his military campaigns and increased soldier pay. This dramatic debasement generated immediate revenue for the imperial treasury, but triggered price increases that persisted for decades and undermined economic stability throughout the Roman world. The practical effects of inflation manifested in daily life as merchants raised prices for basic commodities while wages failed to keep pace with increasing costs. A modius of wheat that cost 3 sestertii during Augustus's reign had risen to 6 sestertii by the time of Marcus Aurelius, and continued climbing as subsequent emperors debased the currency to fund their expenditures. This price inflation particularly affected urban populations who depended on purchased food rather than agricultural production, creating social tensions that could explode into riots when combined with supply disruptions or political instability. The emperor's attempts to control inflation through price regulations invariably failed because they addressed symptoms rather than the underlying monetary problems that drove price increases. Diocletian's Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 CE, established fixed prices for thousands of commodities and services throughout the empire, but merchants simply refused to sell goods at artificially low prices rather than accept losses on their transactions. The edict's enforcement required an enormous bureaucratic apparatus that consumed additional resources while failing to achieve its economic objectives. The crushing cost of maintaining Roman infrastructure throughout 3 continents represented another financial burden that grew heavier with each passing decade as the empire's road networks, aqueduct systems, and public buildings aged and required increasingly expensive repairs. The empire's road system totaled approximately 85,000 kilometers of paved highways connecting major cities and military installations, plus hundreds of thousands of additional kilometers of secondary roads that provided access to rural areas and frontier settlements. These roads required constant maintenance, including resurfacing, bridge repairs, and reconstruction of sections damaged by floods, earthquakes, or military operations. The Appian Way alone, stretching 540 kilometers from Rome to Brindisi, required annual maintenance expenditures of approximately 2 million sestertii to keep its paved surface in acceptable condition for military and commercial traffic. This single road's maintenance costs equaled the annual pay of 500 legionnaires, yet it represented only a tiny fraction of the empire's total road network. Multiplied across the entire system, road maintenance consumed tens of millions of sestertii annually, while providing no immediate political benefits that could justify these expenditures to cost-conscious emperors. Aqueduct systems presented even more expensive maintenance challenges, as these engineering marvels required specialized knowledge and costly materials to repair damage from earthquakes, subsidence, or simple aging of their concrete and stone construction. Rome itself received water from 11 major aqueducts totaling over 400 kilometers in length, including underground tunnels, elevated arches, and distribution systems that supplied public fountains, private homes, and industrial facilities throughout the city. The maintenance of these systems required teams of specialized workers including engineers, masons, and hydraulic experts whose salaries and equipment costs strained municipal budgets. The Aqua Claudia, one of Rome's most important water supplies, required major repairs every decade that cost approximately 5 million sestertii per renovation cycle. These repairs involved replacing damaged sections of the elevated arcade, clearing sediment from underground channels, and updating distribution systems to serve the city's growing population. The emperor could not defer these maintenance projects without risking water shortages that would trigger immediate urban unrest, yet funding them required resources that could have supported entire military campaigns or major construction projects. Public buildings throughout the empire demanded similar ongoing investment as amphitheaters, basilicas, temples, and administrative facilities required regular repairs to remain functional and safe for public use. The Colosseum's maintenance costs exceeded 1 million sestertii annually for routine repairs, including replacement of arena flooring, maintenance of the complex elevator systems that raised animals and gladiators from underground chambers, and upkeep of the canvas awning system that protected spectators from sun and rain. These expenses provided no new political benefits since the building already existed, yet neglecting maintenance would have resulted in structural failures that could kill thousands of spectators and destroy the emperor's reputation. Provincial infrastructure created additional financial drains as governors throughout the empire submitted requests for funding to repair local roads, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings that were essential for maintaining Roman administration and economic activity. The emperor received constant correspondence detailing infrastructure problems, including collapsed bridges in Gaul, earthquake damage to aqueducts in Asia Minor, and road washouts in Britain that disrupted military communications and commercial traffic. Each repair project required imperial approval and funding, creating an endless stream of expenditures that consumed resources without generating new revenue. The impossible choice between raising taxes and cutting spending confronted every emperor with potentially fatal political consequences, regardless of which option he selected. Increasing taxation to fund imperial expenditures inevitably generated resentment among wealthy citizens who possessed the political connections and resources necessary to organize opposition movements against imperial authority. The senatorial and equestrian classes viewed additional tax assessments as a tax on their traditional privileges and economic interests, creating powerful enemies who could finance conspiracies or support rival claimants to the throne. The Emperor Commodus faced this dilemma when his extravagant lifestyle and gladiatorial exhibitions exhausted the treasury's surplus inherited from Marcus Aurelius. His attempts to raise revenue through increased taxation on wealthy citizens triggered a series of conspiracies that culminated in his assassination by palace guards, who had been suborned by senators facing financial ruin from imperial tax policies. The emperor's death demonstrated how fiscal policies could generate the very political opposition they were designed to prevent, creating a feedback loop where financial pressures led to political instability that required additional expenditures for security measures. Alternatively, cutting imperial spending risked triggering military mutinies or urban riots that could prove equally fatal to imperial survival. Soldiers who faced reduced pay or delayed bonuses invariably blamed the emperor personally for their financial hardships, viewing such policies as violations of the implicit contract between ruler and army that guaranteed regular compensation in exchange for military loyalty. The Emperor Galba discovered this danger when his attempts to restore fiscal discipline by reducing military bonuses triggered revolts throughout the empire that ultimately cost him his throne and life. Urban populations reacted similarly to reductions in grain distributions, public entertainment, or infrastructure spending that affected their daily lives and economic opportunities. The Emperor Pertinax's efforts to reduce spending on gladiatorial games and public works projects generated immediate opposition from Rome's urban masses, who interpreted these policies as signs of imperial weakness and indifference to their welfare. The resulting riots created an atmosphere of instability that encouraged the Praetorian Guard to assassinate Pertinax and auction his throne to the highest bidder. The emperor's financial decisions affected not only immediate political stability, but also long-term economic development throughout the empire, as reduced spending on infrastructure and public works could trigger economic recessions that decreased tax revenues and created additional fiscal problems. Roads that fell into disrepair disrupted commercial traffic and reduced trade revenues, while neglected aqueducts could force the abandonment of agricultural areas and urban districts that had previously contributed to imperial tax collections. The emperor faced a complex calculation where short-term spending cuts could generate long-term revenue losses that ultimately worsened rather than improved imperial finances. Military expenses represented the largest and least flexible component of imperial spending, consuming approximately 75% of total revenues during peacetime and even larger percentages during active campaigns. The empire's 28 legions required not only regular monthly pay for approximately 150,000 professional soldiers, but also substantial bonuses upon imperial accession, additional payments for successful campaigns, and expensive retirement benefits including land grants and monetary settlements. These costs were essentially fixed since unpaid soldiers invariably mutinied and often proclaimed rival emperors who promised better compensation. The emperor's attempts to reduce military expenses through troop reductions or pay cuts invariably triggered immediate revolts that could escalate into empire-threatening civil wars. The financial savings from such policies were quickly offset by the enormous costs of suppressing military rebellions, which required the deployment of loyal legions, emergency recruitment of additional forces, and massive expenditures on logistics and equipment. The emperor found himself trapped in a system where military expenses could only increase over time as soldiers demanded regular pay raises to keep pace with inflation and expected larger bonuses to maintain their loyalty during political crises. Auxiliary units and naval forces added additional layers of military expense that could not be eliminated without compromising frontier security and imperial communications. The empire's auxiliary forces totaled approximately 150,000 soldiers organized into specialized units including cavalry, archers, and siege engineers, whose skills were essential for effective military operations. These troops received lower pay than legionnaires, but still required substantial annual expenditures for salaries, equipment, and supplies that strained imperial budgets while providing capabilities that regular legions could not duplicate. The Roman navy, though smaller than the army, required enormous expenditures for ship construction, maintenance, and crew salaries that exceeded the costs of equivalent land forces. A single trireme cost approximately 2 talents to build and required annual maintenance expenditures of 10,000 denarii to keep it seaworthy and combat ready. The empire's naval forces included hundreds of warships distributed among multiple fleets in the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Rhine, and Danube rivers, creating aggregate costs that approached those of several legions, while providing less visible political benefits than land forces stationed near major population centers. The crushing financial burdens that drove emperors to desperate expedients like currency debasement and property confiscation created an even more immediate political nightmare: managing the Roman Senate, whose 600 members possessed the collective wealth, political connections, and institutional memory to destroy any emperor who failed to navigate their complex web of interests and grievances. These weren't mere ceremonial figures from a bygone republican era, but active political players who controlled vast estates throughout the empire, commanded extensive networks of clients and freedmen, and maintained detailed records of every slight, favor, and broken promise in the imperial ledger of political debts. The Senate's relationship with imperial power operated through a carefully choreographed dance of mutual dependence and barely concealed hostility that required emperors to demonstrate strength without appearing tyrannical, show respect for republican traditions without actually sharing power, and maintain the fiction of senatorial authority while systematically undermining it through imperial bureaucracy. This delicate balance consumed enormous amounts of imperial time and energy as emperors attended lengthy Senate meetings, participated in elaborate debates about trivial matters, and carefully managed the complex protocol that governed interactions between imperial authority and republican institutions. Senators arrived at each meeting armed with grievances accumulated over decades of imperial rule, from specific complaints about tax assessments and judicial decisions to broader resentments about the gradual erosion of traditional senatorial prerogatives. These men remembered when their fathers and grandfathers had governed provinces, commanded armies, and shaped imperial policy through genuine debate rather than ceremonial consultation. The institutional memory of the Senate stretched back through generations of accumulated slights and broken promises, creating a collective resentment that could explode into active opposition whenever imperial authority appeared vulnerable. The Emperor Tiberius discovered the dangers of senatorial resentment when his attempts to restore traditional republican procedures backfired by encouraging senators to voice genuine criticism of imperial policies. His decision to allow open debate about provincial taxation triggered a series of speeches that revealed deep-seated anger about imperial confiscations, arbitrary judicial decisions, and the general decline of senatorial influence under the Principate. What began as discussions about specific tax rates quickly escalated into broader attacks on imperial authority that forced Tiberius to choose between abandoning his republican pretenses or suppressing senatorial opposition through intimidation and violence. The emperor's response to these challenges established patterns of senatorial management that would plague his successors for centuries. Tiberius began by encouraging informants within the Senate to report on seditious conversations and potential conspiracies, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned relationships among senators while providing the emperor with intelligence about opposition activities. This surveillance network gradually expanded to include freedmen, slaves, and clients associated with senatorial households, transforming the Senate House itself into a monitored environment where every conversation carried potential political consequences. The treason trials that resulted from this surveillance created a reign of terror that consumed dozens of prominent senators while generating new enemies among their surviving relatives and political associates. The emperor's use of the Maestas law, originally designed to prosecute genuine threats to state security, expanded to encompass virtually any criticism of imperial policies or personal behavior. Senators found themselves facing capital charges for private conversations, casual remarks at dinner parties, or letters to friends that contained unflattering references to the emperor's appearance or decision-making abilities. The psychological impact of these prosecutions extended far beyond their immediate victims to create a climate of fear that paralyzed normal political discourse and transformed the Senate into a theater of imperial sycophancy. Senators learned to speak in careful euphemisms, avoid controversial topics, and demonstrate enthusiastic support for imperial initiatives regardless of their personal opinions. This enforced conformity eliminated the genuine debate and criticism that had traditionally served as checks on executive power, leaving emperors isolated from accurate information about the consequences of their policies. The emperor's financial relationship with individual senators created additional layers of complexity as imperial generosity and punishment became tools for managing political opposition. Wealthy senators who demonstrated loyalty received lucrative government contracts, favorable tax assessments, and opportunities to profit from imperial construction projects and military campaigns. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm for imperial policies faced property confiscations, expensive legal proceedings, and exclusion from profitable business opportunities that could reduce proud aristocratic families to poverty within a generation. Marcus Crassus Frugi exemplified the financial vulnerability that made even the wealthiest senators dependent on imperial favor. Despite inheriting vast estates in Sicily and North Africa that generated annual revenues exceeding 10 million sestertii, Crassus found his fortune systematically destroyed through a series of imperial actions that appeared legally justified but were clearly motivated by political considerations. His criticism of Nero's artistic performances triggered tax investigations that revealed minor irregularities in his provincial holdings, leading to fines and confiscations that consumed most of his liquid assets while leaving him unable to maintain his traditional lifestyle and political influence. The emperor's control over provincial governorships provided another mechanism for rewarding loyal senators, while punishing potential opponents through the distribution of lucrative administrative positions. Provincial commands offered opportunities for legitimate profit through salary and perquisites, plus informal benefits including gifts from local elites, favorable business arrangements, and access to valuable information about trade opportunities and resource discoveries. Senators excluded from these positions found themselves unable to maintain the expensive lifestyles expected of their rank, while watching their political rivals accumulate wealth and influence through imperial favor. The competition for provincial appointments created intense rivalries among senators who understood that their economic survival depended on maintaining access to imperial patronage. This system encouraged senators to compete in demonstrations of loyalty rather than cooperate in opposition to imperial policies, fragmenting potential resistance while providing emperors with detailed intelligence about senatorial attitudes and ambitions. Senators who hoped to secure profitable governorships learned to anticipate imperial preferences and adjust their public positions accordingly, creating a feedback loop that reinforced imperial authority while undermining genuine political discourse. The Senate's ceremonial functions required emperors to participate in elaborate rituals that consumed enormous amounts of time while providing minimal practical benefits for imperial administration. Regular Senate meetings involved complex procedures including formal speeches, ritualized debates, and voting ceremonies that could extend for entire days while addressing issues that the emperor had already decided through private consultation with his advisors. These sessions served primarily to maintain the fiction of republican government while allowing senators to feel that their opinions were being solicited and considered. The emperor's presence at these meetings created awkward situations where he had to appear interested in senatorial advice while avoiding any suggestion that he was actually bound by their recommendations. Claudius attempted to navigate this challenge by participating actively in Senate debates, offering detailed explanations of his policies and responding to senatorial questions with apparent sincerity. However, his genuine engagement with senatorial concerns created expectations that he would modify his policies based on their input, leading to disappointment and resentment when he ultimately implemented his original plans regardless of senatorial objections. The emperor's relationship with senatorial wives and families added another dimension of complexity to political management, as these women possessed their own networks of influence and could serve as channels for opposition activities that bypassed official surveillance systems. Senatorial marriages created alliances between powerful families that could coordinate resistance to imperial policies while maintaining plausible deniability about their political activities. The emperor had to monitor these family connections carefully while avoiding actions that might be interpreted as attacks on traditional Roman family structures. Agrippina the Younger demonstrated how senatorial women could accumulate political influence that rivaled or exceeded that of their male relatives through careful cultivation of relationships with other elite families, freedmen in the imperial bureaucracy, and military commanders seeking advancement. Her network of political allies enabled her to orchestrate Claudius's marriage proposal, manipulate imperial succession planning, and ultimately position her son Nero for the throne despite his questionable qualifications and unstable personality. The emperor's failure to recognize and counter these female political networks created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by ambitious families seeking to advance their own interests. The management of senatorial public opinion required constant attention to symbolic gestures and ceremonial displays that demonstrated imperial respect for republican traditions while reinforcing the reality of imperial supremacy. Emperors had to balance shows of deference to senatorial dignity with clear demonstrations of their ultimate authority, a delicate calibration that could easily tip toward either ineffective weakness or counterproductive tyranny. These symbolic communications consumed substantial imperial resources while producing intangible benefits that were difficult to measure but essential for maintaining political stability. The emperor's participation in religious ceremonies provided opportunities to demonstrate his respect for traditional Roman values while reinforcing his unique position as Pontifex Maximus, an intermediary between the gods and mortal humanity. Senatorial attendance at these events was carefully monitored as a gauge of political loyalty, with absence or insufficient enthusiasm interpreted as signs of potential opposition. The emperor had to ensure that these ceremonies struck the appropriate balance between accessibility and majesty, allowing senators to feel included while maintaining the hierarchical distinctions that reinforced imperial authority. Public games and spectacles served similar political functions by providing venues where emperors could demonstrate their generosity while observing senatorial reactions to imperial policies and personalities. The seating arrangements at these events became complex political statements as the emperor's placement of individual senators communicated messages about favor and disfavor that were carefully observed by all attendees. Senators understood that their assigned positions reflected their current standing with the emperor and could change rapidly based on their recent political behavior. The emperor's management of senatorial opposition required sophisticated intelligence networks that could distinguish between genuine threats and harmless grumbling, while providing early warning of serious conspiracies before they could mature into active rebellion. This surveillance apparatus had to operate with sufficient subtlety to avoid creating the appearance of tyrannical oppression while gathering accurate information about senatorial attitudes and activities. The challenge lay in recruiting reliable informants who could provide valuable intelligence without compromising their own positions or triggering backlash from their targets. The recruitment of senatorial informants followed predictable patterns as emperors exploited financial pressures, personal rivalries, and career ambitions to secure cooperation from senators who might otherwise oppose imperial policies. Senators facing bankruptcy or legal difficulties could be induced to provide information in exchange for imperial assistance, while ambitious younger senators might serve as informants in hopes of securing favorable treatment for their own advancement. These arrangements created webs of mutual dependence that gave emperors leverage over potential opponents, while providing continuous intelligence about senatorial activities. The information gathered through these networks often proved contradictory or unreliable, as senators learned to manipulate the surveillance system for their own purposes by providing false intelligence about their rivals while concealing their own activities. The emperor received constant reports of suspicious meetings, seditious conversations, and potential conspiracies, but determining which intelligence represented genuine threats required analytical capabilities that rarely existed within the imperial administration. This uncertainty meant that emperors often overreacted to false alarms while missing real dangers that had been successfully concealed from their informants. The emperor's response to senatorial opposition had to be calibrated carefully to discourage future resistance without triggering broader rebellion among senators who might conclude that imperial tyranny had become intolerable. Excessive harshness could transform individual grievances into collective resistance, while insufficient firmness might encourage additional challenges to imperial authority. The emperor walked a tightrope where every decision about punishment or clemency carried broader implications for his relationship with the entire senatorial class. The practical enforcement of imperial will against senatorial resistance required careful coordination between various government agencies, including the Praetorian Guard, urban cohorts, and civilian magistrates who might themselves be sympathetic to senatorial concerns. The emperor could not simply order the arrest of prominent senators without ensuring that his commands would be obeyed by officials who maintained their own relationships with the targeted individuals. This requirement for bureaucratic cooperation limited the emperor's options while creating additional opportunities for resistance through administrative non-compliance. The urban plebs of Rome presented an entirely different set of management challenges that required constant attention to the material needs and emotional desires of over 1 million inhabitants, whose political loyalty depended primarily on the emperor's ability to provide adequate food supplies and spectacular entertainment. Unlike the Senate's complex political calculations, the urban masses operated according to simpler but more immediate criteria. They needed sufficient grain to prevent starvation and exciting spectacles to distract them from the harsh realities of urban life in the ancient world's largest city. The grain dole that fed approximately 200,000 Roman citizens represented the emperor's most critical responsibility toward the urban population, as failure to maintain adequate food supplies would trigger riots that could escalate into full-scale rebellion within days. This system required the annual importation of roughly 15 million modi of wheat from Egypt, North Africa, and other grain-producing provinces through a complex logistical network that was vulnerable to weather disruptions, pirate attacks, and administrative failures at multiple points along the supply chain. The emperor personally supervised this grain supply through daily reports from the Praefectus Annani, who tracked ship arrivals, warehouse inventories, and distribution schedules with obsessive precision. Any interruption in the supply chain required immediate imperial attention, as stockpiles in Roman warehouses could feed the urban population for only a few months under normal circumstances. The emperor had to maintain detailed contingency plans for emergency grain purchases, alternative supply routes, and rationing procedures that could be implemented quickly if normal distribution systems failed. The political implications of food shortages extended far beyond immediate hunger, as urban riots could provide opportunities for senatorial conspiracies or military rebellions to exploit popular discontent for their own purposes. The Emperor Claudius faced this danger when delayed grain shipments from Egypt triggered demonstrations that quickly evolved into broader protests against imperial policies and demands for political changes. The urban crowd's chants of bread and freedom revealed how quickly material grievances could transform into political opposition that threatened imperial stability. The emperor's response to these food crises required careful balance between addressing immediate needs and maintaining long-term supply relationships with provincial governors and grain merchants, whose cooperation was essential for continued shipments. Emergency purchases of grain at inflated prices could resolve immediate shortages, but created expectations for similar intervention in future crises, while straining imperial finances that were already stretched by military and administrative expenses. The emperor found himself trapped between the immediate political necessity of feeding the urban population and the long-term fiscal consequences of expensive emergency interventions. The provision of spectacular entertainment for the urban masses consumed even larger resources than grain distribution, while serving primarily psychological rather than material needs. The Roman people's demand for bread and circuses reflected their expectation that the emperor would provide not merely survival, but excitement, wonder, and vicarious participation in displays of imperial power and prosperity. These expectations had evolved over centuries of competitive political entertainment, as ambitious politicians had gradually escalated the scale and expense of public spectacles to win popular support. The gladiatorial games that formed the centerpiece of imperial entertainment required enormous expenditures for trained fighters, exotic animals, elaborate stage sets, and the complex logistics of organizing events that could entertain hundreds of thousands of spectators simultaneously. A single day's games in the Colosseum could cost over 1 million sestertii when all expenses were calculated, including payments to gladiator schools, transportation costs for animals from Africa and Asia, construction of temporary structures and mechanical devices, and the substantial security apparatus required to maintain order among massive crowds. The emperor's personal attendance at these events was mandatory, as his presence transformed entertainment into political theater, where the urban population could observe their ruler's reactions and judge his character through his responses to violence, spectacle, and crowd behavior. The emperor's expressions during particularly brutal gladiatorial combats were carefully watched for signs of weakness, cruelty, or appropriate imperial dignity, with any perceived failures in deportment becoming topics of public discussion that could influence popular opinion about his fitness for rule. The emperor's forced participation in gladiatorial spectacles, as both host and unwilling performer in the theater of imperial politics, revealed a fundamental truth that would haunt every ruler who wore the purple. Even the most successful emperors could not escape the violent deaths that awaited nearly all who claimed supreme power in Rome. The statistical reality was stark and unforgiving. Of the first 25 emperors from Augustus through Diocletian, only 5 died peacefully of natural causes while still in power. The remaining 80% met their ends through assassination, suicide, execution, or death in battle, creating a mortality rate that exceeded even the most dangerous military campaigns or gladiatorial combats. This extraordinary death rate wasn't merely the result of ancient Rome's generally violent culture or primitive medical knowledge. Ordinary Roman citizens, despite facing plague, warfare, and the harsh realities of pre-modern life, enjoyed far greater personal security and longevity than their emperors. A wealthy senator could reasonably expect to live into his 60s or 70s, dying peacefully in his villa surrounded by family and friends. A successful merchant might accumulate vast wealth and pass it to his children without facing constant threats of assassination or confiscation. Even common soldiers, despite the obvious dangers of military service, had better survival prospects than the men who commanded them from the imperial palace. The methods employed to eliminate emperors revealed the intimate nature of imperial vulnerability, as most assassinations were carried out by individuals with close personal access to their victims. The Praetorian Guard, supposedly the emperor's most loyal protectors, murdered at least 8 emperors, including Caligula, Commodus, and Pertinax. Palace servants poisoned Claudius and possibly Tiberius. Military officers killed Caracalla, Aurelian, and numerous others during campaigns or inspections. Family members eliminated Domitian through a conspiracy that included his wife Domitia. The emperor's inner circle, rather than providing security, became the primary source of mortal danger. The assassination of Commodus on New Year's Eve 192 CE exemplified the calculated brutality that characterized imperial murders. The conspiracy involved his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and Praetorian prefect Letus, all individuals who enjoyed unlimited access to the emperor's private quarters and daily routine. The plot unfolded with methodical precision as Marcia first attempted to poison Commodus with wine, but when he vomited up the toxin, the conspirators dispatched Narcissus, an athletic trainer, to strangle the weakened emperor in his bath. The murder required only minutes to complete, but but it had been planned for months by people who understood exactly when and where Commodus would be most vulnerable. The intimate nature of these assassinations reflected the impossible security challenges that confronted every emperor. Unlike modern heads of state, who can rely on sophisticated technology and professional security services, Roman emperors depended entirely on human loyalty in an environment where every person with access to the imperial presence possessed both the means and potential motive for murder. The emperor had to eat food prepared by palace cooks, drink wine served by trusted cupbearers, sleep in chambers guarded by Praetorian soldiers, and bathe in facilities maintained by household slaves. Each of these daily necessities created opportunities for assassination that no amount of paranoia could completely eliminate. The development of increasingly sophisticated assassination methods demonstrated how the emperor's enemies adapted to imperial security measures with deadly creativity. Simple poisoning evolved into complex techniques that could bypass food tasters and medical examination. Agrippina's alleged murder of Claudius involved coating a feather with toxin and using it to induce vomiting after the emperor had consumed poison mushrooms, allowing the poison to be introduced directly into his throat during the purging process. This method left no obvious traces and could easily be attributed to natural illness or food poisoning. Mechanical devices provided alternative assassination methods that could be triggered remotely or activated by the victim's own actions. Domitian's murderers reportedly used a concealed blade mechanism that was activated when the emperor grasped what appeared to be a routine document, causing a spring-loaded knife to pierce his hand and deliver a fatal wound. These elaborate contraptions required careful planning and technical expertise, but they offered the advantage of allowing assassins to maintain distance from their targets while ensuring lethal results. The psychological warfare that preceded many imperial assassinations involved systematic campaigns to isolate emperors from potential supporters while convincing them that resistance was futile. Conspirators spread rumors about the emperor's mental state, circulated stories about divine omens predicting his death, and arranged for fortune tellers and astrologers to deliver prophecies that encouraged the emperor to believe his fate was sealed. These psychological operations served both practical and emotional purposes by reducing the likelihood of effective resistance while providing moral justification for the conspirators' actions. Caligula's assassins employed these techniques extensively during the months before his murder, spreading stories throughout Rome about the emperor's increasing madness and divine displeasure with his behavior. Palace servants reported strange dreams and supernatural occurrences that supposedly foretold imperial doom, while priests discovered unfavorable omens in sacrificial animals and celestial observations. This campaign of psychological intimidation created an atmosphere where the emperor's death seemed inevitable and even divinely ordained, reducing potential opposition to the conspiracy while encouraging additional participants to join the plot. The timing of imperial assassinations often coincided with moments of apparent triumph or security, when emperors believed they had successfully overcome their enemies and could finally relax their vigilance. Caracalla was killed during what should have been a routine stop during a military campaign, when he had dismissed his Germanic bodyguards to relieve himself privately. Commodus died during New Year's celebrations, when he was focused on entertainment rather than security concerns. Domitian was murdered in his own palace during what appeared to be a normal administrative meeting with trusted advisors. This pattern reflected the assassins' understanding that successful emperors were most vulnerable when they believed themselves to be safe, as periods of apparent security led to reduced precautions and increased access for potential killers. The psychological burden of constant vigilance meant that even the most paranoid emperors eventually experienced moments of relaxation that could be exploited by patient conspirators who had spent months or years waiting for the perfect opportunity. The aftermath of imperial assassinations revealed how quickly imperial authority could collapse once the emperor's personal presence was removed from the political equation. The death of Pertinax in 193 CE triggered immediate chaos as the Praetorian Guard auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder, while competing claimants emerged in various provinces to challenge the legitimacy of whoever emerged from this unprecedented transaction. The empire's vast administrative apparatus, which had functioned smoothly under imperial direction, suddenly found itself without clear leadership or unified command structure. The speed with which imperial achievements could be undone following an emperor's death demonstrated the personal nature of Roman imperial power and the fragility of political arrangements that depended entirely on individual authority rather than institutional continuity. Caligula's architectural projects were abandoned or demolished after his assassination, while his political appointments were reversed and his supporters faced persecution or exile. The emperor's personal vision for the empire died with him, leaving behind incomplete monuments and half-implemented policies that his successors often abandoned or actively opposed. The posthumous character assassination that frequently followed imperial deaths represented a systematic attempt to justify the emperor's murder, while delegitimizing any potential restoration of his policies or supporters. The process of damnatio memoriae involved the deliberate erasure of the deceased emperor's name from inscriptions, the destruction of his portraits and statues, and the prohibition of any public mention of his achievements or memory. This institutional forgetting served both practical and symbolic purposes by eliminating potential focal points for opposition, while demonstrating the new regime's complete rejection of its predecessor's legacy. Domitian's damnatio memoriae was implemented with particular thoroughness, as the Senate ordered the destruction of thousands of inscriptions, coins, and artistic works that bore his name or image throughout the empire. Stonemasons were employed to chisel his name from public monuments, while metalworkers melted down bronze statues and silver coins that depicted his likeness. The process required enormous resources and coordination across multiple provinces, yet it was considered essential for establishing the legitimacy of Nerva's succession and preventing any restoration of Domitian's supporters to positions of influence. The destruction of imperial monuments often extended beyond mere erasure to include deliberate desecration that expressed popular anger about the deceased emperor's policies or behavior. Commodus's statues were not simply removed, but actively mutilated by crowds who smashed facial features, severed limbs, and covered the fragments with excrement and garbage. These acts of symbolic violence provided emotional release for populations who had suffered under imperial oppression, while serving as warnings to future emperors about the consequences of excessive tyranny. The financial costs of implementing damnatio memoriae could be substantial, as the destruction of existing monuments had to be followed by the creation of new artistic works that celebrated the successor emperor, while obliterating all traces of his predecessor's visual presence. The replacement of Commodus's portraits throughout the empire required the commissioning of thousands of new sculptures, paintings, and mosaics that depicted Pertinax and later Septimius Severus in appropriate imperial poses. These artistic projects consumed resources that could have been used for infrastructure improvements or military equipment, yet they were considered essential investments in political legitimacy. The selective nature of historical memory meant that even emperors who achieved significant military or administrative successes could be remembered primarily for their failures or personal flaws if their deaths occurred under circumstances that encouraged negative posthumous evaluation. Caracalla's extension of Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire through the Antonine Constitution represented one of the most significant legal developments in imperial history, yet this achievement was overshadowed by his reputation for cruelty and his murder of his brother Geta. Later historians focused primarily on his violent temperament and military failures rather than his contributions to Roman legal and social development. The failure of even successful emperors to secure peaceful transitions of power revealed fundamental structural problems within the imperial system that no amount of personal competence or achievement could overcome. Marcus Aurelius, widely regarded as the most capable and virtuous ruler of the imperial era, spent his final years desperately attempting to prepare his son Commodus for the responsibilities of imperial power, while simultaneously managing military campaigns along the Danube frontier. Despite his philosophical training and extensive administrative experience, Marcus Aurelius could not solve the basic problem of imperial succession that had plagued the empire since Augustus. The philosopher-emperor's decision to elevate Commodus as his successor reflected the impossible choices that confronted imperial fathers who understood their sons' limitations, but felt compelled by dynastic expectations and political pressures to maintain family control over imperial power. Marcus Aurelius had witnessed the chaos that followed emperors who died without clear heirs, including the civil wars that erupted after Nero's suicide and the military conflicts that consumed the empire during the Year of the Four Emperors. His choice to promote Commodus represented an attempt to prevent similar instability, even though he privately doubted his son's fitness for imperial responsibilities. The systematic undoing of Marcus Aurelius's achievements during Commodus's reign demonstrated how quickly imperial accomplishments could be reversed by incompetent successors who lacked both the ability and inclination to maintain their predecessors' policies. The Danubian Wars that had consumed 12 years of Marcus Aurelius's reign and achieved significant territorial gains were effectively abandoned, as Commodus negotiated hasty peace treaties that surrendered most of his father's conquests in exchange for immediate cessation of hostilities. The financial reserves that Marcus Aurelius had carefully accumulated through fiscal discipline were squandered on gladiatorial spectacles and palace luxuries that provided no lasting benefit to the empire. The philosophical writings that represented Marcus Aurelius's intellectual legacy were ignored or actively suppressed by Commodus, who showed no interest in Stoic principles or rational governance. The administrative reforms that had improved provincial government and military efficiency were gradually dismantled as Commodus appointed favorites and flatterers to positions that required technical expertise and moral integrity. Within a decade of Marcus Aurelius's death, virtually every aspect of his legacy had been corrupted or abandoned by a successor who possessed imperial authority but lacked any understanding of its proper application. The irony that the most powerful position in the ancient world offered its holders less personal security, happiness, and longevity than ordinary Roman citizens enjoyed became increasingly apparent as imperial history accumulated examples of rulers who traded comfortable private lives for the deadly privileges of supreme power. Wealthy senators could enjoy their villas, libraries, and family relationships without facing constant threats of assassination or the crushing responsibilities of governing 50 million people across 3 continents. Successful merchants could accumulate fortunes and pass them to their children without worrying about military rebellions or Praetorian conspiracies. Even common soldiers, despite the obvious dangers of military service, could retire after 25 years of service with land grants and pensions that provided security for their remaining years. Emperors, by contrast, could never truly retire from their positions or escape the political pressures that defined their existence. Diocletian's voluntary abdication in 305 CE represented the only successful imperial retirement in Roman history. Yet even this carefully planned withdrawal required elaborate arrangements to ensure his personal safety and prevent attempts to restore him to power against his will. The precedent was so unusual that it was never successfully repeated, as subsequent emperors who attempted to abdicate faced assassination, forced restoration, or exile that often proved more dangerous than continued rule. The psychological toll of imperial power manifested in the documented mental health problems that affected numerous emperors, including the paranoid delusions that consumed Tiberius's later years, the apparent psychotic episodes that characterized Caligula's behavior, and the severe depression that Marcus Aurelius described in his personal writings. The constant stress of making life and death decisions, while facing persistent threats from multiple directions, created psychological pressures that would challenge even modern individuals with access to professional mental health support and sophisticated stress management techniques. The emperor's inability to form genuine personal relationships added another dimension of isolation that distinguished imperial existence from normal human experience. Every friendship carried potential political implications. Every romantic relationship involved calculations about succession and dynastic planning, and every family gathering required security precautions that prevented spontaneous emotional expression. The emperor lived surrounded by people, but remained fundamentally alone, unable to trust anyone completely or express vulnerability, without risking exploitation by enemies who monitored his every word and gesture for signs of weakness. The ultimate failure of the imperial system to provide either effective governance or personal satisfaction for its participants became increasingly evident as the empire entered the crisis of the 3rd century, when rapid turnover of emperors reached pathological levels. Between 235 and 284 CE, approximately 50 individuals claimed imperial authority, with most reigning for less than 3 years before meeting violent deaths. This period of military anarchy demonstrated that the structural problems inherent in the imperial system had reached a point where no individual, regardless of personal capability or political support, could maintain stable control over the empire's vast territories and competing constituencies. The emperor's purple toga, which had begun as a symbol of supreme authority and divine favor, had evolved into a death shroud that marked its wearers for elimination by the very forces they nominally commanded. The transformation was complete. The most coveted position in the ancient world had become its most dangerous, offering unlimited power at the price of almost certain violent death. The throne of the Caesars, built on the promise of bringing order to the Roman world, had become instead a monument to the impossibility of absolute power and the inevitable corruption of those who sought to wield it. In the end, the Roman emperors discovered what their republican predecessors had always feared, that concentrating unlimited power in a single individual inevitably destroyed both the ruler and the state he claimed to serve. The purple toga that Augustus had worn as a symbol of restored peace and prosperity became, for his successors, a magnificent burial shroud that marked them for death from the moment they accepted its deadly privileges. The empire survived, but its emperors did not, victims of a system that demanded godlike perfection from mortals and punished any display of human weakness with swift and brutal elimination.